I've just asked a question about something that was not clear to me, so if anything is unclear to you, please ask, whether it's some acronym or whether it's a particular rule, just ask, or you can also post your questions in the chat and we will get them asked in this session. I will provide you with a recording of the previous session and also with the training slides for yesterday and today after this session. All right, and now I will let John take over. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Polina, and great to see you all again. Welcome to today's session. So before we start today's session, any questions at all on what we covered yesterday or last week? Any comments on that? Any worries about it? There'll be time for Q&A at the end, but anything that you want to ask now, please feel free to do so.
I just had one mostly going back to the first session.
Yeah.
Around the official certificate of origin.
Yeah.
Is the provenance of that down to national regulations? Because I've seen sort of some traders in the past have come to me and said, can I do it? And I've not normally directed them back to the local chamber of commerce. Is that kind of the normal route for a certificate of origin for, say, for a primary mineral that's been mined somewhere?
Yeah, it is. In most countries, it will be the Chamber of Commerce that certifies certificates of origin. John, thank you for asking. It's a really good point. There's, so normally the situation is, because remember, it's not the Chamber of Commerce, it's the exporter who is declaring origin. All the Chamber of Commerce will do is put a rubber stamp on it and say, well, we don't really know, but we think they're telling the truth. That's all the certification is. Chambers of Commerce, I can remember when I started my career, one of the organizations I worked for was a shipping agent, a forwarding agent. And one of my jobs, didn't get the great jobs when I first started as a graduate trainee. One of my jobs, every afternoon towards the end of the day, we used to raise documentation for our clients, and at the end of each day I would get all the certificates of origin together for our various clients that we'd generated for them that day, and I'd take them to the Chamber of Commerce, and they'd say to me, okay, come back at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning and you'll get the certified copies. And we were just one organization, and a fairly small organization. And every day we were taking in probably about 25, 30 certificates of origin for certification. They were always ready 9 o'clock the next morning. And when I got to know the people at the Chamber of Commerce a little bit, I got brave enough to say to them, how can you do that? I bring the documents in. We're just one company doing it. Other companies are doing it as well. We're bringing the documents in at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. 9 o'clock the next morning, I collect them and they're all certified. How can you check the origins that quickly? And the guy just burst out laughing. And he said, we don't check the origin. How can we? He said, there's no way we can do that. All we're doing is certifying what the exporter has said. And that certification is purely saying we believe it to be correct, but we're not actually saying it is correct, because the exporter may not be telling the truth. And I suddenly realized that certification actually means nothing whatsoever. And there's a lot of work being done at the moment, led by the World Trade Organization, and it's all about cutting out the need for certification of things like certificates of origin, because the certification means nothing. The important thing is that the exporter or the manufacturer, if it's manufactured goods, in other words, the body nearest the product, they're the ones who are declaring the origin. Now, they're declaring the origin either for non-preference reasons or for preference reasons, but it is that party that's declaring the origin. All the Chamber of Commerce are doing is putting a rubber stamp on it. So, John, to go back directly to your question, in most countries, it will be a Chamber of Commerce that does that. In some countries now, they've cut out the need for chambers of commerce intervention because, frankly, it's money for nothing. The chambers of commerce charge for it, but there's no value add. All they're doing is putting a rubber stamp on it, but they're not checking anything. They can't possibly do that. In most countries, currently, it is the chambers of commerce that will do that. In some countries, it will be the customs authorities. In other countries, it will be other regulatory authorities that have the job of doing it. But you're absolutely right. The common thing, the most common thing, is actually chambers of commerce at the moment. But, in the coming years, I think we're going to see a big change to that. Because, frankly, the certification means nothing. What really matters is that the exporter has done their research before they give a declaration of origin. Now, if it's a mineral that's come straight from a mine, there's not going to be any question about the origin. It shouldn't be controversial in any way whatsoever. But the thing you have to remember, and again, we touched on this on Monday, is that as soon as if you then take that mineral and it goes to another country, even if you carry out the smallest activity on it, a very small activity. You guys are the experts on minerals, I'm not. But, if you did a small activity on it, a small process, that can change the origin. It may not, but it may change the origin every time you have to check the rules of origin for the countries concerned against the commodity code for that mineral. And that's a check that has to be done every single time. Because even the smallest action, the smallest process may change the origin. It may not, but it may change the origin. John, does that answer that okay?
Yes, thank you. On that one about people doing small changes, I think some of the big companies make a lot of money with blending operations in Taiwan for that very reason, to feed into China post blending.
Yeah. And, depending on the rules of origin, it can just be a very, very minor process that's taking place, and that can change the origin. It may not, but it may do. And, obviously, if it does change the origin, and then there can be an advantage of a free trade agreement or putting the goods into free circulation duty free, then clearly there's a benefit in doing that. Absolutely. Great. Thanks for that, John. Good point. Thank you very much. Any other questions or comments? Okay, so let me now share my screen. Oh, by the way, just to say, we will do the normal thing. We'll break at round about 2:30 UK time, which is UTC +1. Then we'll reconvene half an hour later. And as I mentioned yesterday, I'm trying to allow, and probably will be able to allow, plenty of time for Q&A at the end. I want to allow at least half an hour for Q&A, as this is the last session. So my aim is that, I will kind of finish talking round about 4 o'clock or before 4 o'clock UK time. Hopefully it'll be before 4 o'clock, and then we can go into Q&A on everything that we've covered during the 4 sessions. So that's the plan. Let me share my screen. Okay, can I just check if someone could tell me if you can see the full screen?
I can see it, yes.
Brilliant.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, lovely. Thanks, Paulina. So today we're talking money. We're going to talk about export credit control, methods of payment and the options available, some of the finance options, and then a bit of a focus on the end about letters of credit, because there's lots and lots of misunderstanding on LCs, on letters of credit. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. It's all about money. And let's start off with a bit of a generalization, but some good news. Well, I think it's good news. And that is that actually, even though in international trade, getting paid can be more complicated than domestic trade, one of the realities is we can actually make it safer than domestic trade. We can make getting the payment or securing the payment more safely than we can with domestic trade. And the reason I say that, and you'll see this as we go through the various methods of payment a bit later on, but the reason I say that is because a key thing to remember as we talk about this today is that in international trade, the documents represent the goods. Without the documents, the buyer, the importer, cannot take delivery of the goods. So by having control of the documents, whether the seller has control or the buyer has control, by having control of the documents, we've got control of the goods. And as you'll see later on, we can use that as leverage to get paid. And jumping ahead to what I'm going to be talking about later, what you are going to see is that many, or in fact most, of the methods of getting payment in international trade are based on exchanging the documents for the payment. And that protects both parties, and we'll look at how that works a bit later on. But a key starting point is export credit control. It's the payment thing. So if you think right back to day one, when we looked at this graphic, we've got the contracting at the top. We've got the physical movement of the goods. We've got the documentation. And, we've covered those three elements in previous sessions. This session, we're going to talk about payment. And if we talk about, a simple transaction, you've got a buyer and a seller, an importer and an exporter. The importer has got to pay the exporter, in other words, the buyer's got to pay the seller. And they may pay them directly, probably through something like a bank transfer, but most likely they're going to pay them through the banking, they're going to pay them through the banking system. And we'll look at how that works a bit later on. So before we can really talk about the methods of payment, we've got to think about what is the export credit risk. And this is often missed out. I can remember a couple of years ago working in East Africa, and I was training exporters in Zambia, the copper exporters, the cobalt exporters in that region, and not just mineral exporters, but other products as well. And it was really interesting when this was actually on behalf of the European Union, and when we put the training program together, as I always do, I said to the EU, okay, what do you see as the content? What should the content be? And they had, most of it they was very, very reasonable. Contracting had to be there, shipping and logistics had to be there, insurance had to be there, customs compliance had to be there, rules of origin had to be there. They left out export credit control. And I said to them, don't you want me to cover export credit control and getting paid so that the mineral exporters and all the other exporters in the region, in Zambia, in Democratic Republic of Congo, in Zimbabwe, in Mozambique, in Malawi, so that they can secure their payments. And the EU kind of said, I was in Lusaka at the time in Zambia, and the EU delegation there said, oh yes, that's a good idea. And I don't really get shocked by these things anymore, but I was a bit surprised because what can be more important from a seller's perspective than getting paid? It's crucial. Why sell your copper if you're not going to get paid for it? There's no point. Now, from an exporter's point of view, before they can work out the important things, and there are two things the exporter's got to work out. And again, we'll expand on this later on. But the exporter's got to consider for every transaction what's going to be the method of payment and what's going to be the term of payment. And they're two different things. The method of payment is how am I going to get paid? Is it going to be collection, letter of credit, open account? How am I going to get paid? That's the method of payment. The term of payment is when am I going to get paid? Am I going to give the buyer credit or do I want the payment straight away? In international trade, if it's payment straight away, we call it payment at sight. And there's a traditional reason for that because traditionally it means on sight of the documents. When the documents have been cited, payment becomes due. That's the traditional reason for doing that. So anyway, what it really means nowadays, if an exporter says, I want sight payment, it means that's immediate payment. Generally, it doesn't have to be. Generally, that can be linked with the Incoterm, and it would generally be when the goods are legally delivered. So with most Incoterms, that's going to be on dispatch of the goods. But, in international trade, most buyers are going to ask for credit. The export cycle, the sales cycle can be a long cycle. The material's got to be shipped before the buyer they've got to receive it. The buyer's got to receive it. They've got to customs clear it before they get value. So the sales cycle can be quite long. Because of that, most sensible buyers are going to ask for credit. 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, and that becomes the term of payment. So there's going to be a method of payment. How is the exporter going to get paid? And there's going to be a term of payment. When is the exporter going to get paid? And the exporter, the seller, excuse me, can't make decisions on that until they've assessed the risk. Oh, excuse me. And what I always say to exporting companies is the most important department in your company is the export credit control department. That's the most important department, export credit control. So they've got to assess the risk. And there are several risks they've got to think about. So from a seller's point of view, now, if you're selling either domestically or internationally, there's always going to be a commercial risk. And the commercial risk is defined as a risk of non-payment within the buyer's control, or risk of non-payment due to an activity by the buyer. So the commercial risk is things like the buyer just decides they're not going to pay, or they've got a cash flow problem, or they go bankrupt, or it's a de-Incoterm and they don't like the product when they receive it. There can be loads of reasons. But the commercial risk is a risk within the control of the buyer. And whether you trade domestically or internationally, there will always be a commercial risk that the buyer won't pay. So the seller has got to assess the commercial risk of their customer. Are they credit worthy? They've got to do that. And they've got to do that whether it's domestic trade or whether it's international trade. Now, if it's an international trade, there's a bundle of other risks they have to think about. The banking risk, because generally in international trade, the payment will be affected by two banks, a bank in the seller's country and a bank in the buyer's country. The bank in the buyer's country will transfer the money to a bank in the seller's country. So there are going to be two banks involved in the transaction. And the seller has got to assess the banking risk. I'm selling to Nigeria. What are the banks like in Nigeria when they transfer the money? Are they going to do it on time? What happens if they're short of foreign exchange? Those are the kind of things I have to think about. So there's going to be a banking risk that has to be assessed. There's going to be a political or a sovereign risk. You know, countries, and we've seen so much of that this year, countries have political arguments, if you like, with each other. You know, they have disagreements, and they may not just be trade disagreements, but they may have disagreements that have an effect on their trading capabilities. So there are lots of things that can happen. And these are outside the control of the buyer. There may be a civil war. There may be two governments have a disagreement about something. There could be unexpected non-tariff barriers put in place, loads of things that can happen. And that could impact on the buyer's ability to pay. It may be the buyer would go to their central bank and say, okay, please transfer $100,000 to the exporter in the Netherlands. And the central bank will say, really sorry, we can't do that. At the moment, there's a block on transferring money to the Netherlands. There's a bit of a diplomatic dispute going on. We are not allowed to transfer any money to the Netherlands. Or more likely, they may say, really sorry, we can't do it this week. There's no foreign exchange. We've got no euros. You know, talk to us again next week. There may be some euros available. So there are lots of risks, political and sovereign risks that may happen. There are also country risks, things like earthquakes, storms, natural disasters that can affect any country. The banks may not open because of something like that. If the banks don't open, how can they transfer the money? And adding to all of that, then of course you have got the transit risk that the goods will get lost, broken, stolen, pilfered during the transit of the goods. Now, that only becomes a payment risk when the de-Incoterm is being used. But if a de-Incoterm is being used, then that's something else that you have to think about. Because, you know, if you've never legally delivered the goods, you will never be entitled to get paid if you're the seller. So that's the key there. And if we drill down a bit more, these are the kind of things that we're talking about. So with commercial risk, remember the key thing is that is generally within the control of the customer. And remember, there's always a commercial risk, whether you're trading domestically or internationally. And examples of that, the customer, the buyer is insolvent. If they've got no money, there's no point in suing them because they've got no money. Or maybe it's a D Incoterm, you're selling under a D Incoterm and they don't accept the goods when they arrive. Or maybe you're selling under a D Incoterm and they do accept the goods, but they still don't pay you for them. Those are kind of standard customer or commercial risks. Or maybe they're simply having a short-term cash flow problem. And then the country political sovereign risks, exchange control restrictions. I think I mentioned the other day that, the countries that everyone's getting really excited about now are the emerging economies. I think we spoke about this a little bit the other day, that many, many markets are deemed to be saturated. But the emerging markets, people are getting really excited about them. It was the mint countries, Mexico, Indonesia, Nigeria. Oh gosh, what's the T? Thailand, I think it was. But we keep on seeing these different acronyms, these different groupings. But markets are emerging and people are getting really excited about the new emerging markets. But one of the features of them is that they will be investing heavily in infrastructure. Last week, I used the example of Nigeria, completely new port being built at Lekki, a new airport being built at Lekki, costing billions and billions and billions of dollars, euros and pounds. They're going to be short of foreign exchange because of that. But that's because their economy is growing exponentially. So we have to think about exchange control restrictions. Now we can, as a seller, as an exporter, we can work with that by having, something like a letter of credit as the payment methodology. But we need to know if those are in place before we can decide on the payment method. So there may be exchange control restrictions. Collapse of the banking system. Now, isn't it interesting? Let's think back to the banking crisis of 2008, the global crisis. Now, interestingly, when before 2008, when I was teaching about export payments, export finance, trade finance, then of course I would warn exporters and say to them, be careful. When you're trading with countries like Venezuela, Mexico, Cambodia, Nigeria, the banking system could collapse. So be really careful. Make sure you have confirmed letters of credit, things like that. Then the global financial crisis happened. And of course, the whole environment changed because, frankly, if you look at it, it wasn't Nigerian banks collapsing, it wasn't Indonesian banks, it wasn't Mexican banks, it wasn't Venezuelan banks, it was French banks, it was US banks, it was English banks. So it was the OECD countries whose banks were failing. And a lot of stories have come out of that now. That's 2008. It was a long time ago, but it takes time for them to sift through. And I'm not going to mention names here, but I was talking to someone last year. Earlier this year, in fact. And they were the chief executive of one of the major UK banks that nearly collapsed. He's retired now. But it was one of the major banks that nearly collapsed. And he told me the story. He said during the crisis, while it was going on, he said on one occasion, one morning, he got his reports in from his colleagues and he could see the situation was really, really dire. And he realized that something had to be done very, very quickly. And he was the chief executive of a very big bank in the UK, a very important bank. And he realized he needed to speak to the Prime Minister. And you can't just dial a phone number and get through to the Prime Minister. So, he went through the process. And everyone he spoke to, all the gatekeepers of the Prime Minister, they could tell this was something really serious. So eventually, they did actually put him through to the Prime Minister. And what he said to me was, he said, and I said to the Prime Minister straight away, unless the Bank of England steps in today, and it needs to be today, this bank will go bankrupt. We will run out of money. Now, if a UK bank ran out of money, there would be, you can just imagine the chaos. There'd be a run on all of the banks that would spread throughout Europe. We were members of the European Union at the time. That would have, there would have been a contagion effect all over Europe. So the Bank of England did step in, and that bank didn't collapse, fortunately. But it just shows how near things were back in 2008. And the key thing here is that, collapse the banking system, it doesn't necessarily mean it's a bank in an emerging market. It could be a bank in any country. Now, having said that, since 2008, and because of 2008, banks are actually stronger now than ever before. New rules have come in, new international rules called the Basel II rules. They've come in, and now banks are much, much stronger than they were before. So could it happen again? I'm a real believer in never saying never, but it's more unlikely than ever that there would be a collapse of the banking system. But nevertheless, it is a risk that has to be considered. Then we get things like internal conflict, civil unrest. Society now, that can happen in any country. There are triggers, and the world seems a very, very fragile place at the moment in many, many countries. Things seem to be very, very much on the edge, and you can get situations in any country where, and it may just last a day or 2 days, when you've got civil unrest, you've got internal conflict, the banks don't open during that period because it's dangerous for them to open. So they don't open, they can't make any transfers, and that can delay payment. Government interventions, political events, as I said, there may be arguments between two countries. We're going to cut you off the SWIFT system. That's a threat that's, been hanging over Russia in the last few years, that they will be disconnected from SWIFT. SWIFT being the system the banks use to move money around the world. So government intervention due to political events, and then trade and licensing restrictions, sanctions. We've seen that again in Eastern Europe with the Russia situation. Trade and licensing restrictions. Well, with the USA tariffs, we've seen issues about that as well. So there are loads of things that can affect payment. Some of them are within the control of the buyer, and those are the commercial customer risks, but many of them aren't. And those are the country, political, or sovereign risks. Okay, let me pause there. Any questions so far? Or comments? Okay. So, how would the seller choose the method of payment? And ideally, it's going to be by negotiation between seller and buyer. But the seller's the one who's the exporter, they're the one who's going, or the trader, they're the one who's going to need to get paid. So generally, it is the seller that's going to have primacy on choosing the method and the term of payment. Just to remind you, the method of payment is the how. How is payment going to take place? The term of payment is the when. When is payment going to take place? So what is the seller going to think about? And the first and most important aspect is minimizing the credit risk. Looking at all these things and all the rest of them, these are just some examples. So considering all of these things and thinking, okay, I've done my assessment of the customer commercial risk. I've also assessed the country political sovereign risk, and this is the result I've come to. And there's a golden rule that I always mention in companies, and that is that no one should outrank or countermand the export credit controller once they've come to a decision. Because export credit control is a science. It's not an art, it's a science. And that function of export credit control, minimizing the credit risk, of course, is crucial. Credit controllers have a saying, which makes a lot of sense. And that saying is, a sale is not a sale until it's been paid for. And that, I think, makes a lot of sense. So the seller's main criteria is going to be minimizing the credit risk. Then they're going to look at their own need for funds. If they're cash strapped, if they're in a difficult cash situation, then there is no way they should be giving credit. A buyer, if I'm the buyer, I'm going to ask for credit. I would say to the seller, okay, I want 90 days credit. But if the seller is cash strapped, then they would probably say to me, really sorry, we're not going to give that to you. It's got to be payment at sight. And this can become a really big issue. I've seen this so often, where a buyer puts pressure on a seller saying, I want credit, give me 30 days, 60 days. And the buyer the seller almost panics. They want to keep the sale. So they say, okay, we'll give you 30 days credit. And they can't really afford to give that credit. And they've got to wait 30 days for payment. And while they're waiting, they run out of money, they get cash strapped, they're sued, they go out of business. It happens so often, and I'm not exaggerating when I say it happens a lot. It really does happen a lot. So that's really important. Exporters need to look at their own need for funds before agreeing a payment term. Never give credit if you can't afford to. Okay, now they may be able to use methodologies like discounting with a bank. We'll talk more about that later on. So there are kind of compromises that sellers can do. They may be able to say to a bank, okay, we need the money straight away, but we will accept less than the contract value, but we want it now. And that's called discounting. So they may be able to discount under certain circumstances. The other thing that it's always good to do is look at usual terms for sales to the importing country. A seller doesn't have to do what the usual terms are, but it gives an idea of what most people are doing, and it does give an idea of the country risk. For example, anyone selling to Indonesia, to Venezuela, to Nigeria, to Mozambique is going to ask for a confirmed letter of credit. Anyone selling to Canada, Australia, Saudi Arabia, European Union is probably going to be happy with open account as long as the credit checks are okay. So when we talk about the usual terms for sales to the importing country, you don't have to follow those, but they just give an idea of what most people do. What are competitors offering? Because, if you're an exporter, there will be competitors. So what are most competitors offering? You look at what the competition are doing. Now, you don't have to do what competitors are doing. Maybe they're giving open account at 90 days. Maybe you can't afford to do that. So it'd be crazy to follow what they're doing. But it's always good to know what the competition is doing. And if you can offer something better than competitors are offering, that's great. You may not be able to protect your own interests, but maybe you can do something better. Maybe competitors are offering open account at 30 days, and you may think, okay, we've dealt with that buyer for years now. We're doing all right for cash at the moment, so let's offer them 60 days or 90 days, then we'll get the business. So what competitors are offering, that can, help in making the decision as well. And of course, the effect of bank charges. Of course, in international trade, you will be using banks to move the money from the buyer to the seller. And of course, there is a cost which will be captured within that. But remember, the party that pays the bank charges, that will be decided at contract stage. The normal thing is that in most cases, the seller will pay the bank charges in their country and the buyer will pay bank charges in their country. But it could be something different's been negotiated. Maybe in the contract it says the buyer pays all the bank charges or the seller pays all the bank charges. So that will always be a matter of negotiation at the time of contracting. And frankly, in most cases, bank charges aren't, they're not going to be a very, very big element of the contract price. But the big thing is, in terms of selecting the correct method and term of payment, the most important takeaway there is the seller, the exporter, must consider all the risks, both the commercial risk and all the country, political and sovereign risks as well. If the seller only considers the commercial risk, they could be making a very, very big mistake in the payment method. If they only consider the political sovereign country risk, they may be making a very big mistake in deciding on the payment method. So this is the important takeaway. The export credit controller has got to consider all the risks before they can come at a scientific method of payment and term of payment for each transaction. Okay, any questions so far, please? Any comments? Okay. So what have we got in relation to methods of payment? Now, as you can see there, there's a whole list. Letters of credit I'm going to cover right at the end. Okay, we're going to leave those. Those are the letter of credit is, they can be quite complicated, but not nearly as complicated as most people think. They can be a bit complex. But what we're going to come back to later on is the fact that the letter of credit is actually the only payment method that protects both the seller and the buyer. No other payment method does that. So we'll leave that till the end. So let's have a look at the extremes first. And the extremes are the first and the last method of payment that you can see on that list. Oh, sorry, I did that too quickly. So the two extremes are cash in advance and open account, payment in advance. So payment in advance, the exporter getting paid in advance, that sounds great, doesn't it, from the exporter's perspective, but it makes the buyer very, very vulnerable. If I'm the buyer and I have to pay in advance, how do I know that the goods are going to be shipped, that they're going to be the right goods, the right documents will be generated, and I will get the documents? How do I know? I'm taking a huge risk if I pay in advance. And in some countries, where buyers are located, governments will not allow payment in advance because of the vulnerability to the buyer. Governments in many countries are also worried that payment in advance may be linked to money laundering. That's another concern that governments have. So payment in advance, cash in advance sounds great, but it's not good for the buyer. And it's not good for a long-time business relationship. So the kind of situation where payment in advance may be used is a situation where I'm the seller and you contact me and you say, John, I need 20 kilos of this very special metal from you. I know you've got some. I need to buy it from you. It's a real emergency. I need you to get it on an airplane tomorrow. And I would say to you, look, I'd love to help you, but we've never traded with you before. We don't know you. There are risks involved. You want it really quickly. So for that reason, we will do it, but we want payment in advance. And if I'm desperate, if the buyer is desperate, they may say, okay, we will pay you in advance. We'll do a transfer today. And then the buyer will just hope the goods are going to be shipped, the right documents will be generated. It's a risk. It is a risk. But that's the kind of situation where cash in advance would be used. When it's a very, very high risk situation from the seller's point of view, they don't know the buyer. Maybe the country risk is high as well. The buyer says they want it straight away. There's no trading relationship. The seller may say, okay, pay us in advance and we'll ship the goods to you. Okay, we'll go ahead. So that's payment in advance. It's not good for a long-term business relationship. Now, the opposite to that, the most low risk situation is open account. And if I'm the seller, that means I'm selling to a low risk customer in a low risk country. Okay, so maybe I'm in the UK, I'm selling to someone in France. I've traded with them for the last 5 years. They've always paid on time. France, actually, with what's going on in France at the moment, maybe I shouldn't say this. Let's go to Germany instead. Selling to Germany. Germany is a low country risk. I've traded with a customer in Germany for a long time. They always pay on time. So it's a low risk transaction. I may say, okay, we'll trade with you on open account. We'll give you 30 days. And the seller relies on the buyer to pay them on time. Very often with open account, it may be supported by credit risk insurance. And credit risk insurance, just like we can insure the goods if they get damaged, broken, or stolen, we can also insure against the risk of not getting paid. And that's called credit risk insurance. So open account can leave the seller vulnerable. So very often with open account, the seller will have a credit risk insurance policy. So if the buyer doesn't pay, then the seller can get payment under their credit risk insurance policy. So those are the two extremes: cash in advance for the most high risk environments, open account for the most low risk environments. Those are the two extremes. Any questions on those so far before we start looking at the other ones? Okay, so all the other payment methods that you can see there on the screen are based on the principle of documentary exchange. And that principle is very, very straightforward. In international trade, the documents represent the goods. So the goods get shipped, and the seller, the exporter, generates the documentation, sometimes in conjunction with third parties, possibly like the carrier or a chamber of commerce. But basically, the seller is in control of the documents: invoices, packing lists, bills of lading, certificates of origin, analysis certificates, inspection certificates. The seller is in control of the documents. And the principle of documentary exchange is very straightforward. The seller says to the buyer, okay, I will release the documents to you once you've paid me, or once I've secured your payment. So I've got the documents. You as the buyer, you've got the money. You give me the money and I'll give you the documents. And with those documents, you can customs clear and take delivery of the goods. And that's what the principle of documentary exchange is. It's an exchange of documents for payment. And apart from cash in advance and open account, all the other methods of payment you can see on the screen, all of those are based on the principle of documentary exchange. And the simplest way of doing that is cash against documents, or payment against documents. Probably we're not going to use banknotes, but payment against documents, or it may even be banknotes. And the way that works is exactly as it sounds. So I'm sitting here in the UK and I'm selling to a buyer in India, and we agree on cash against documents. So I ship the goods to India, I generate the documentation, invoices, packing lists, certificate of origin, bills of lading, analysis certificate. I've got all the documents. And I make an agreement with the buyer in India. Okay, I've got the documents, you've got the money, where do we do the exchange? And we may decide to do the exchange in Dubai. We meet up in Dubai. The buyer from India has got the money, cash, or more likely, we don't really want to deal in cash because that can get messy. More likely, an official bank draft, something like that. I, as the seller, have the documents. The buyer hands me the bank draft and I hand over the documents. In its simplest form, that is cash against documents. Now, do we really want to do that? Do we really want to go to the trouble of having to meet somewhere to do that exchange? There could be security issues, there could be reliability issues. Do we really want to do that? Probably not. So probably what we're going to do is use the banking system to exchange the documents for the money. And then we change it. It's no longer cash against documents. It becomes a bank collection. And with the bank collection, what I'm going to do, I'm the seller in the UK, I'm selling to a buyer in India. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ship the goods to India. Once the goods have been shipped, I'm going to get all the documents together, invoices, packing lists, bills of lading, certificates of origin, analysis documents, whatever they may be. I'm going to get all the documents together. I'm going to hand the documents to my bank, and I'm going to say to my bank in London, please collect payment from my customer in India, and I'll give them the details of my customer. My bank in London will then send the documents to their correspondent bank in India. All the banks have relationships with other banks in different countries. So my bank in London will send all the documents to the bank in India with whom my bank in London has a relationship. The bank in India will then contact my customer and say to them, come and take up the documents. My customer will go to the bank in India and say, okay, here are my banking details. You can now debit my account. The bank in India will debit the account of the buyer. And once they've debited the account of the buyer, they will release the documents to them. The bank in India will then transfer the money to my bank in London, and my bank in London will put the money in my account. And that's a bank collection, sometimes called a documentary collection. Now, with a documentary collection, a bank collection, that would only be used in kind of medium to low risk environments. You wouldn't use that in a high risk environment because there are two issues with bank collections. One of them is a vulnerability for the seller, and one of them is a vulnerability for the buyer. So vulnerability for the seller, what's that? Well, let's go back to me as the exporter in the UK, and I've got a customer in India. So I ship the goods to India, I get all the documentation together, and I hand them to my bank in London. And I say to my bank in London, please collect payment from my customer in India. My bank in London sends the documents to their correspondent bank in India. The correspondent bank in India contacts my customer and says, please come and take up the documents. And my customer says to the bank, no, I won't. I don't want the documents. Now, if they don't get the documents, they won't be able to get the goods. So the buyer still has the goods, but they're on the way to India. They're going to have to get them back because the buyer has refused to take up the documents. So at least the goods are protected, but the seller, me in the UK, I'm going to have to find a new buyer for the goods in India or else bring the goods back to the UK. So that's one of the vulnerabilities from the seller's point of view. The buyer may refuse to take up the documents. But there's also a vulnerability from the buyer's point of view. So from the seller's point of view, a vulnerability, the buyer may not take up the documents. From the seller's point of view, let's look at the scenario again. I'm the seller in the UK. I ship the goods to my customer in India. I get the documents together. I present them to my bank in London. They send them to the bank in India. The bank in India contacts my customer. You're getting the gist of this now. My customer goes into the bank. They authorize their account to be debited. The bank in India releases the documents to the buyer in India. So the payment then goes from the bank in India to my bank in London into my account. So I've got the payment in my account. My customer in India has the documents. They go to their freight forwarder, give them the documents, and say to their freight forwarder, please customs clear the goods for me and take delivery. And the freight forwarder looks at them and says, really sorry, these documents do not fulfill the requirements of India customs. They're not fit for purpose. I will not be able to clear the goods with these documents. Because with a bank collection, the banks are not responsible for checking any documents. All they're doing is exchanging a package of documents for payment. They have no responsibility to do any checks on the documents. And that's the vulnerability for the buyer. So with a bank collection, there's a vulnerability for the seller and a vulnerability for the buyer. From the seller's point of view, The buyer may refuse to take up the documents. From the buyer's point of view, they may take up the documents and authorize payment of the seller, but the documents may not be fit for purpose. So it's not a foolproof system, and you would only use a bank collection in a medium to low risk environment. Okay, let me pause there. Any questions so far? Okay, so we then have the bill of exchange, not widely used anymore, but still used. What's the definition of a bill of exchange? Well, there you go. This is the official definition. A bill of exchange is an unconditional order in writing addressed by one person to another, signed by the person giving it, requiring the person to whom it's addressed to pay on demand or at a fixed or determinable future time a sum certain in money to or to the order of a specified person or to the bearer, in other words, the holder of the bill of exchange. So that all sounds a little bit confusing. The best way to think about a bill of exchange, it's the opposite to a check. If I owe you money, I owe you $10. I can give you a check for $10. If you owe me $10, I can give you a bill of exchange for $10. And once you've signed that bill of exchange, you are accepting the fact that you owe me $10. If you don't give me that $10, I can take that bill of exchange to the judge in a court of law, and the judge will uphold the payment. So a bill of exchange is the complete opposite to a check. You use a check to give someone, if you owe someone some money, you give them a check to pay them. If you give them a bill of exchange, they owe you money. And once they've signed it, they've agreed legally that they have to pay you the money. If they don't pay you, a judge will uphold the payment when the bill of exchange is presented to a court of law. That's what a bill of exchange is. And if it's an avalized bill of exchange, that means the bill of exchange also has the guarantee of a bank. So that if the buyer doesn't honor the bill of exchange, then the avalizing bank, the guaranteeing bank, will honor the bill of exchange. So as I've mentioned, not used very much anymore, but they are still there. Sometimes for commodity trades, bills of exchange and avalized bills of exchange, those are the instruments that are used. So there we go. When we talk about methods of payment, we talk about the risk ladder. And it's a bit of a generalization, but there is an element of truth in saying that when we look at the payment methods, the best method of payment for the seller, in many ways, is the worst for the buyer. And the worst for the buyer is the best for the seller. You know, there's an element of truth in that, and you can see that on this graphic here. And, you know, what we actually have in the middle. So, for example, from the exporter's point of view, if we look at that, the highest risk is open account because they're trusting the buyer to pay them. They will have done their credit checks, country check, sovereign check, political check, commercial check. They've done all the checks and said, OK, we're going to go for open account. And the lowest risk is going to be advance payment, but advance payment is very, very high risk for the importer, for the buyer. But as you can see in the middle, we have the documentary collection, the bank collection, and the letter of credit. We've spoken about the bank collection, and as I've mentioned, it's not foolproof. There's a vulnerability for the seller and a vulnerability for the buyer. It can go horribly wrong. But you know, you would only use a documentary collection in a low to medium risk situation. And that leaves the documentary letter of credit. And as I've mentioned, we're going to look at that in some detail because the letter of credit is the only payment method that protects both the seller and the buyer. So before we look at the letter of credit, any questions so far? You know, we can take this slowly. It's really important.
I have a question.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Concerning especially cash against documents.
Yes.
is that possible to give just to work on the copies by email or
Well,
some
very
digit
unlikely.
copies?
I mean, it depends how knowledgeable the buyer is. If I'm the buyer, I'm not going to pay you on copy documents because the whole point is the documents represent the goods. But with the copies, I can't take delivery of the goods. So I'm not going to pay you just on copy documents. I want the originals because I want to know that by paying you, I've then got documents by which I can customs clear and take delivery. So, it's very, very unlikely that a buyer would accept cash against documents based on copy documents. If I was the buyer, I wouldn't, most certainly.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Good, but a good point. Thank you very much for asking.
If anyone has any other questions, please raise them. And if for some reason you can't speak, please type them in the chat and we'll raise them now.
Okay, I can't see anything. So just before we talk about letters of credit, let's just have a very brief look at some other trade finance options that you've got. Now, most of or a lot of these aren't really used very much, but just for the sake of completeness, I think it's important to talk about some of them. And you may remember a few minutes ago, I mentioned that there are ways that a seller can give credit to the buyer and get the money straight away. And that's called discounting. Sometimes it's called forfeiting. And that's basically getting a bank involved and saying to the bank, okay, I've got an invoice for 100,000 euros. Payment to me is at 60 days. I need the money straight away. Will you discount the payment? And the bank may say, okay, we will give you the money straight away, but you will only get 90,000 euros. And that's what discounting is. It can be used with documentary collection. It can be used with letter of credit. It can be used where there's a bill of exchange. So the forfeiting organization is generally going to be a bank. Of course, they'll charge for it. They're not going to discount or forfeit free of charge. There'll be a charge for that. And of course, you don't get, as a seller, you don't get the full invoice value. But it's a way of giving the customer credit, but getting payment straight away if you need to do that. So that's what discounting is. The old-fashioned expression was forfeiting. I think nowadays most people call it discounting. Then we have factoring, and that's when you sell your invoices as a seller. You sell your sales invoices to another company, they buy the invoices from you, and then they collect the payment from your customers. And of course, once again, you're not going to get the full invoice value because the factoring company, they're taking on the risk, they're buying the risk from you, or you're selling the risk to them. So you're not going to get the full invoice value, but you're de-risking the situation. The factoring company pay you, and then they collect the payment from your customer. So not used that much, but it can be good if you're worried about getting payment. You don't want to use the other methods of payment to give, to give secure payment and so on. We then have credit risk insurance, which I spoke about a few minutes ago, generally used with open account. From the seller's point of view, if you use open account, you're vulnerable. You're trusting the buyer to pay you. Now, as a seller, you're not going to allow open account until you've done stringent, they're going to be credit checks on your customer and all the country sovereign political risk checks as well. All the checks have to be done. But even so, once you've done the checks, things can still go wrong at the last minute. So very, very often, when you're trading under open account, you will get credit risk insurance. And credit risk insurance, as I mentioned earlier on, just like you can insure the risk of the goods getting broken or lost or stolen, you can also insure on the risk of not getting paid. And that's what credit risk insurance is. In many countries, credit risk insurance is run by a government agency. Here in the UK, we have UK Export Finance, UKEF, and they run credit risk insurance in the UK. But there's also a commercial market. Companies like Coface, what are they called? Nomura. There's quite a few of them. So there's a commercial market, but in some countries it's run by government. So in the UK, there's a credit risk insurance agency, as I mentioned, UK Export Finance. In Zimbabwe, they have a government credit risk insurance facility. Many countries do. And in some countries, I mean, this tends to be mainly for capital projects, but some countries, they have government supported biofinance, where they help buyers finance capital projects. So, for example, in the UK, the UK wanted to get part of the project to build a new port in Nigeria. So the government in the UK, they provided finance for the ministry in Nigeria that are building the port. They gave them finance, but they had to get part of the project from UK suppliers. So government supported biofinance means, the government is actually paying the exporter on behalf of the buyer. That's what government supported biofinance is. I wouldn't say it's widely available, and it's generally only for big projects, big programs. However, I know, when I was working with the UK and putting together the critical minerals import policy, there's talk about that using government supported biofinance for critical minerals as well. It's not happening yet, or not so far as I know is it happening yet, but it could be something in the future. Export houses used to be very popular, very prevalent. Really, they're dying out now. There aren't so many of them. An export house is basically when you've got a manufacturer, a producer, a seller, a trader. They don't want to get in, they've got buyers in different countries, but they don't want to get involved in the export process. So they sell their product to export houses in their own country, and the export house takes on the actual export of the goods. So not so prevalent as they used to be, but they are, there's availability to a smaller extent. And then we have different kinds of letter of credit, which I'm going to come back to when we talk about letters of credit, back-to-back and transferable letters of credit. Those are financing tools as well. So what you can see there with the options, credit risk insurance is quite widely used, but the rest of them aren't really used that much. But the thing is, they're used to an extent, and they can be very, very good trade finance tools. So any questions on that before we start on letters of credit? Okay, so always good to start off with a definition. So what is a letter of credit? And we'll take this bit by bit. It's a guarantee of payment by the issuing bank, in other words, the bank issuing the letter of credit, a guarantee of payment by the issuing bank to the seller. So as soon as the letter of credit is opened, it's a guarantee of payment by the issuing bank to the seller. So just from that sentence, you've probably gathered that there's one risk that we've removed completely from the seller's point of view. As soon as the LC is open, the letter of credit, it's a guarantee of payment by the issuing bank to the seller. So, can someone tell me what level of risk have we removed once the LC is opened?
Buyer's liquidity.
Yeah, we've removed, thank you very much, John. Absolutely. We've removed the commercial risk. The payment is no longer anything to do with the buyer. The payment is coming from the bank that opened the letter of credit. There is no more commercial risk. So that's the first thing to bear in mind. As soon as the LC is opened, I just, if I say LC, that's my abbreviation for letter of credit. As soon as the LC is opened, we have a guarantee of payment by the issuing bank to the seller. There is no more commercial risk. The buyer cannot stop the payment. They can't. The payment will be made by the bank. But the payment is conditional. So, a guarantee of payment by the issuing bank to the seller, conditional upon presentation of documents to a nominated bank. So, the letter of credit will list a series of documents. And those documents have to be presented by the seller to a nominated bank in the seller's country. Okay, so the issuing bank, they're not just going to pay the seller's got to present documents listed in the letter of credit. They've got to present those documents to a nominated bank in the seller's country. And those documents, they're just not any old documents. They've got to be documents which strictly comply with all the terms and conditions, all the wording of the letter of credit. So put all of that together, a letter of credit, it's a guarantee of payment by the issuing bank to the seller, conditional upon presentation of documents to a nominated bank in the seller's country, and the documents must strictly comply with all the terms and conditions stated within the letter of credit. That's the definition. So, any questions on that? Okay, we'll take this bit by bit by bit. Okay, so important thing to remember, the letter of credit is the only trade payment method that protects both the seller and the buyer. Every attempt, and letters of credit have been used for, I'm not exaggerating when I say they've been used for centuries, at least 300 or 400 years. And it may seem a bit crazy in the current digital age, but the letter of credit, but no one's found a way of bettering the LC system. There have been attempts. I think about 10 years ago, the banks introduced something called the bank payment obligation, the BPO. They thought that would be a good alternative to the letter of credit. I think it lasted about 5 years and it just wasn't effective. So they've stopped doing that. And now we've heard a lot about blockchain solutions. Some of the banks have been talking about that. They haven't actually implemented them. No bank has implemented a blockchain alternative. So currently, there is no other payment method that protects both the seller and the buyer. And that's an important thing to remember. So it really is unique. Why is it unique? First of all, from the seller's perspective. From the seller's point of view, the seller has security of payment as long as the documents they present to the nominated bank are compliant with the letter of credit. So the seller has this guarantee of payment as long as the documents presented to the bank are correct and compliant and in strict conformance with the letter of credit. So that is the seller's security of payment. From the buyer's point of view, the buyer is assured that they will get the correct documentation to legally import the goods, and they will also get documentary proof that the terms of the sales contract have been performed by the seller. So, when you look at the concerns of the parties, the concern of the seller, am I going to get paid? The concern of the buyer hasn't seen the goods. The buyer has no knowledge that the seller will comply with the sales contract. And they want to know that the seller will comply with the sales contract before the seller gets paid. So from the buyer's point of view, that's their worry. The buyer wants evidence that the seller has presented documents by which they, the buyer, can legally import the goods into their country, and also documents to prove that the seller has performed the sales contract. If the seller has performed the sales contract and they have presented documents needed to import the goods, then the buyer would be happy for the seller to get paid. So by using the letter of credit, we're protecting both the seller and the buyer, and that's critical. So some of the myths from the exporter's point of view. Firstly, many exporters think, there's a rule that documents have to be strictly compliant with the letter of credit. And many exporters worry, if we make a spelling mistake in a document, we won't get paid. That's complete rubbish. A spelling mistake is not a discrepancy. And there are rules for letters of credit. We're going to look at the rules later on. A spelling mistake is not a discrepancy. And if there is a spelling mistake, the exporter will still get paid. That's a myth. Okay. There's another myth that the letter of credit only supports the seller, the exporter, by securing payment. That's a myth as well, because the letter of credit also protects the buyer, because the buyer, they list the documents the seller must present, and they will list documents to make sure they get the documents they need to legally import the goods, and documents by which the seller has to prove they've carried out the sales contract. So the letter of credit doesn't just support the exporter, it also supports the buyer, the importer. They're too complicated. That's interesting. I mean, it's very, very true. You do know how to, you have to know how to use them. You have to know the rules. But it really, again, takes me back to early in my career. And I can remember one of my early jobs, which I think I mentioned the other day, was with a manufacturing company. They made batteries. And I think I may have mentioned to you that in that company, when you started there as a graduate trainee, it was based in the UK, everyone started working with the department that dealt with exports to Ireland, Southern Ireland, because it was easy. It wasn't complicated. The documents were easy, the shipping was easy, everything was easy. So everyone started there, and then you went to another department. So after I did my time on the Ireland department, I think I mentioned last week, I went to the West Africa department. And my new boss said to me, John, anything you're worried about, now that you're with us, with the West Africa department. And I said to my boss, well, I know that we always get that, with all the exports to all the African countries, we always get paid by letter of credit. And I've heard that, and I said to him, I know nothing about them, but I've heard they're really complicated. And my boss said to me, actually, they're not complicated. They are the easiest way to export. He said to me, there's no guesswork. We get the letter of credit. It comes to us through the banking system, and it tells us exactly what we have to do with that consignment. There's no guesswork. It should be replicating the sales contract. And we look at it. We make sure we can do everything we're being asked to do. And it would tell us there's no guesswork. We don't have to worry, do we need to sign the invoices? The LC would tell us. If we have to sign them, it will call for signed invoices. We don't have to think, is a certificate of origin needed? The LC would tell us. It will ask for one or it won't ask for one. So my boss said to me, it's the easiest way to export because everything we need to do is mentioned on that letter of credit. And he said, the great thing is, when you prepare the documentation, you just follow the requirement on the LC. You follow the wording on the LC onto the documents. That's what you do. And then we present those documents to a bank and we get paid. So even though it's true, you do need to know the rules. That's very important. And we're going to look at some of them later on. But the fact is, once you've got the letter of credit, it tells you exactly what you need to do. So many people, including me, would argue it is the easiest way to export. There's no guesswork. And at the end of the day, not only is it the easiest way to export, but you get paid at the end of it, as long as you get it right. And the other thing is they are always expensive. Well, of course, there will be bank charges. Of course, there will be. But you get what you pay for. What you pay for. As an exporter, you get security of payment. As an importer, as a buyer, there's no worry. You know you will get the documents you need to legally import the goods. And you know the seller won't get paid until they've proven by documents they've carried out the sales contract. So as a buyer, they're protected as well. And the cost of a letter of credit, I mean, when you're trading internationally, there's always going to be bank charges anyway, even if you're getting paid by bank transfer, even if it's not even a documentary collection, there's always going to be charges. With a letter of credit, because the banks are taking risk, there will be more charge. Of course, there will be. And the charge will reflect the risk the bank is taking. So, of course, there will be bank charges, but the charges will be commensurate with the risk the bank is taking and the fact that you're getting a service from the bank. So I would argue they can be expensive. They're not always expensive, and they can provide, and very often do provide, very, very good value for money. So, it's not always the cost, is it? It's very, very often the value for money, what you're actually getting for that expense. And do bear in mind, as a seller or a buyer, that there's a market for opening and confirming letters of credit. So if you're a buyer, you don't have to use your own bank to open the LC. You can go to any bank that will do it for you. You can negotiate with them. Okay, my bank is charging me 1% or 0.5%. What will you charge me? Will you give me a better deal? So remember, bank charges are always negotiable. And the other thing to remember is that, of course, and I mentioned this earlier on, that which party pays the bank charges, that will be negotiated at the time of contracting. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the standard position is that the seller will pay the bank charges in the country of export and the buyer will pay the bank charges in the country of import. So that in a letter of credit, the buyer will pay the opening charges and the seller will pay the advising bank's charges. But it doesn't have to be like that. It may be you've negotiated that the buyer pays all the charges or the seller pays all the charges. Again, that's subject to negotiation. So I just wanted to dispel some of those myths because they are myths. Okay, any questions, any comments so far? Okay, so when to use a letter of credit? When would you actually use one? And these are the kind of circumstances. I mean, you can use one whenever you want. That's really what it comes down to, because it does protect both parties. But these are the most likely situations when you would use an LC. Firstly, if the transaction, the payment risk is high. So if either the country risk or the commercial risk, either of those, or both of them for that matter, if either or both is high, that would be a good reason to use a letter of credit. If the risk is high, what are your options? They're payment in advance, but that leaves the buyer very, very vulnerable. In many countries, they're not allowed to pay in advance. So in that case, a much better option, if the risk is high, is to use a letter of credit. In some countries, it's a requirement. In some importing countries, because they want to control foreign exchange, actually using a letter of credit as a method of payment is compulsory. For example, in Nigeria, if you sell to Nigeria, the Central Bank of Nigeria will only authorize foreign exchange if it's done under bank collection or letter of credit. They won't authorize open account or payment in advance. They won't do that. It's a federal rule in Nigeria under federal law. Payment has to be by letter of credit or by bank collection. So sometimes it may be a requirement in the country of importation, and that's very, very often the case where, there are exchange control restrictions in the emerging markets. In general, even if the risks appear to be low, the seller may still be concerned about receiving payment in full and on time. They may think, actually, the buyer's been a bit tricky. We've got a contract with them, but we think they're going to try and find reasons when payment time comes to not pay us in full or not pay us on time. So if there's any concern about that, the credit controller may say, well, it's a kind of borderline situation with this customer. Even though the country political sovereign risk is low, and that customer, they have paid us on time in the past, we're just, the credit controller may say, I'm just getting a little bit of a feeling about that customer. They're querying a few things. I'm just getting a little bit worried they may not pay us in full, or they may not pay us on time. That would be a good reason to use a letter of credit. Or it may be the buyer's decision. The buyer may be worried, will the seller perform the sales contract? For example, will the seller provide documents which the buyer needs to get the goods? Will the goods be the right quality or quantity? In the letter of credit, for example, the buyer may put in a clause asking for pre-shipment inspection by someone like our friends from Intertek or another inspection company. And there can be other things as well. There can be a lot of things. Maybe the sales contract says the goods are of EU origin. Okay, that could be a key thing. But the buyer is worried, are they really EU origin? Well, they can put a clause in the letter of credit. Goods to be of EU origin, certificate of origin to this effect is required, and then they're getting proof of that. So very often it's going to be the buyer who insists on it. The buyer may be concerned about the seller's capacity or their intention to perform the sales contract. In that case, the buyer can control the situation by opening a carefully opened letter of credit, making sure that they ask for the correct documentation. And sometimes it can be used to support export finance. Because the reality is that if you're a seller, once you've got that letter of credit, you've got a conditional guarantee of payment. And with that conditional guarantee of payment, you can actually go to a bank and say, look, here is collateral. I've got a letter of credit of 500,000 euros from my customer in Saudi Arabia. I've got that LC. Okay, please give me a loan using that as collateral. I need a loan to buy some product from Zambia to sell to Saudi Arabia. Give me a loan using that letter of credit as collateral. So supporting export finance and a letter of credit is considered to be collateral when you're negotiating, trying to get export finance. So there's a whole bundle of scenarios there where using a letter of credit would be the right thing to do. And very, very often, it's going to be, in many cases, buyer and seller, both of them are going to be really happy with that. Not always, but, very, very often that will be the case. Both parties will be really happy with that. But sometimes you get pushback. A buyer may say, no, I don't want to open a letter of credit. A seller would have to think, well, I wonder why that is. Maybe it's because the bank was saying, we're not going to open it. If the buyer goes to a bank and asks for a letter of credit, the bank will not open it before they've checked the commercial risk of the buyer. Okay, so if a buyer says, I can't open an LC, that could tell you the buyer is not creditworthy. Or it could be, very likely, and this happens quite a lot, the buyer just doesn't know how to go through the process. I find myself training a lot of importers on how to open a letter of credit, what to ask for when you open an LC. So it could be lack of knowledge, but it also could be because the buyer is not creditworthy and the bank have said, no, we're not going to open a letter of credit for you because you're not creditworthy. That could be the reason. So it can be a little bit of a warning sign if a buyer ever says to you, we're not going to open an LC because we don't want to, then your next question should be, why not? What is stopping you? It could be their creditworthiness. But sometimes from the seller's point of view, the buyer may say, okay, we'll pay you by opening a letter of credit. And the buyer may say, yeah, I'm not sure we really want to do that. We're not very good at getting the documents together. We're not very good at generating correct documents. Well, immediately from the buyer's perspective, if I'm the buyer, I would say, well, that's exactly why we want to open an LC, to make sure you do generate correct documentation. But I think also, there really is a lot of folklore. As I've mentioned, there are these myths. There's a lot of folklore about letters of credit. I hear it a lot from exporters. We don't want to open an LC. If we make a spelling mistake, we won't get paid. If we put a full stop in the wrong place, we put a comma in the wrong place, we won't get paid. We don't know how to present compliant documents. But actually, it's pretty easy. All you have to do is copy the wording from the LC onto the documents. But those are the things that we hear over and over again. And realistically, you can't get over the fact that an LC is still the only payment method that protects both seller and buyer. Okay, that's all there is to it, protects both the seller and the buyer. But there's got to be rules to LCs, and we have a set of rules for LCs, and we'll talk about that later on. So a good point to pause here, I think. So let's pause here. Just before we pause, are there any questions so far? Okay, so We'll pause now for the break. Then after the break, we'll look at how does an LC work. We'll look at the procedure flow for how the letter of credit works. We'll look at the different types of LCs because, as traders, you may want to use things like back-to-back letters of credit or transferable letters of credit, which I'll talk about a bit later on. So we'll talk about the different kinds available, and then we'll have a brief look at the rules governing LCs. In the time available, we can't go through the whole thing, but we'll have a brief look at the rules so that you can get a taster for the rules governing letters of credit. So let's break now. It's just about coming up to 2:30 UK time. If we could please reconvene in 30 minutes at 3 o'clock UK time, which will be UTC +1. Okay, thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, John. We'll see you at 3 o'clock.
See you at 3 o'clock.
All right, okay. Fine, yeah. I was just we're running training today, so I wasn't able to answer that. All right, thanks a lot. Okay, thank you. Bye. Hi. Hi. A second. How was the delivery? Oh, what's that? Okay.
Okay, welcome back, everyone. So to continue on letters of credit, firstly, the terminology can be a bit confusing. So let's have a quick look at that, and then we'll have a look at how the whole thing works. So in relation to the terminology, the buyer or the importer, they're known as the opener because they go to a bank to open the letter of credit. The opening bank is a bank in the buyer's country. Generally, it doesn't have to be, but it will usually be in the buyer's country. And that's the bank that will actually issue the letter of credit, sometimes known as the issuing bank or the opening bank. The nominated bank is a bank in the exporter's country, and that's the bank to whom the exporter presents documents in order to get paid. They're known as they're known as the nominated bank. And the nominated bank will advise the letter of credit to the exporter. They may also confirm it. I'll explain confirmation a bit later on. And then finally, the seller or the exporter, they're known in banking terms as the beneficiary because they get the money. So those are generally going to be the parties involved. The buyer, who is the opener, the seller, who's the beneficiary, and two banks, the opening bank that issues the letter of credit, and a nominated bank in the seller's country that will advise and may also confirm the letter of credit to the seller. Those are the four parties. So how does it all work? Well, let's just run through this. So at the top, you can see you've got the four parties. From the right, you've got the exporter, the seller. Then you've got the nominated bank, the advising bank or confirming bank in the exporter's country. You've got the issuing bank in the buyer's country. And finally, you've got the buyer, the opener, the importer. So how does it all work? Well, the first thing is, of course, there's going to be a contract between seller and buyer, even before the letter of credit's been thought about. So there will be a contract between seller and buyer. And if you think to last week, that contract will have a payment clauses term in it. There'll be a clause in the contract about the payment terms. And it's at that contracting stage that agreement will be made that payment is to be by letter of credit. The next action is with the buyer. The buyer will go to a bank and open the letter of credit. So, as I mentioned earlier on, they'll probably go to their own bank, but they don't have to. They can go to any bank that would do a deal for them. And they'll go to the bank and say to them, we're buying some goods, we're buying some material from a supplier in the UK, and the value is going to be 50,000 euros. And we want you to open a letter of credit in favour of the seller for 50,000 euros. So they're going to go to a bank. Now, the bank, they're not just going to open the LC straight away. They're going to check that the buyer is good for the money. Because remember, as soon as they open the LC, the bank has to pay the seller as long as the seller presents correct documents. So as soon as the LC is opened, the bank has a risk. And they're really going to make sure that the buyer is good for the money. If they're worried about the buyer's creditworthiness, they may say to the buyer, okay, we'll open you a letter of credit for 50,000 euros, but before we open it, we want the money. We want the 50,000 euros, and then we will open the LC. Or they may say, no, you're a really good customer of ours. We know you very well. You're well capitalized. We will open it and we'll debit you at the time we hand over the documents. So there'll be an agreement between the opening bank and the buyer, but the opening bank is going to make sure that they can, basically get the money from the buyer. They won't open it until they know that. And as I mentioned, if a buyer says, oh, I can't open an LC, that may well be because they're not creditworthy. It tells you a story. Okay, so they go to the bank and they say, please open a letter of credit, 50,000 euros to pay our supplier in the UK. The bank will do the checks on the buyer, and once they're happy, they'll say to the buyer, okay, we're happy to open an LC, please complete the application form. And the buyer will complete an application form. And basically what they're going to be doing is on that form, they will list a series of documents that the seller has to present in order to get paid. Now, if they're trained in what they're doing, if they know what they're doing, they're not just going to, pick documents at random, say, oh, I think we need bills of lading, I think we need 6 invoices. They're going to check what they really need. So the first thing they're going to do is check the import requirements of their country. So if the buyer's in India, they're going to look, what documents do I legally need, or do I need to legally import the goods into India? And they'll look at the detail. And the detail may be India Customs, they want 6 original signed invoices. Then that will be a letter of credit requirement. There'll be, in the list of documents, it will include 6 originally signed commercial invoices. It may be they need a certificate of non-preference origin certified by a Chamber of Commerce. That will be on the letter of credit. One original certificate of origin stating the non-preference origin of the goods, certified by an authorized Chamber of Commerce. That will be on the LC. So anything that they need, any document they need to legally import the goods, they will list those documents on the letter of credit. The next thing they'll do is they'll look at the sales contract. And they'll look at what the exporter has promised to do under that contract. And they'll list a series of documents by which the exporter has to prove that they have carried out the sales contract. So, to give you a silly example, but an example that makes the point, it may be that it was agreed in the contract that all the product has to be packed in green boxes. Okay, that's in the contract. Goods to be packed in green tri-wall cartons. Then that will be on the letter of credit. Goods to be packed in green tri-wall cartons, beneficiary's certificate to this effect is required. So the LC will say the goods must be packed in green tri-wall cartons, and the beneficiary, the exporter, must provide a certificate saying that they've done so. On the sales contract, it may say goods to be shipped by containerized sea freight no later than the 1st of November 2025. That will be on the letter of credit. 3 original, 3-copy bills of lading to be presented, evidencing the goods have been shipped by container sea freight no later than, no later than the 1st of November 2025. That was agreed in the contract, so that becomes a clause on the letter of credit. In the contract, it may say that the goods must have pre-shipment inspection by Intertek Inspection Services. And it will go on to, so that would be on the letter of credit. That would be on the LC. The LC will say something like, pre-shipment inspection to be conducted by Intertek Inspection Services, clean certificate of inspection stating the goods are as per this contract must be presented. And that means before shipment, the goods must have an inspection. The inspection company must issue an inspection certificate, and that certificate must state that the goods meet the requirements of the sales contract. So there'll be a whole list of documents, and what you can probably see is by listing those documents, the buyer, the importer, in India, they can be sure they're going to get documents that they need to meet the legal import requirements in India. That's the first thing. And secondly, they're going to ask for documents to prove that the seller has performed the sales contract. So all of that will be listed on the letter of credit. So the buyer will complete the application form and they'll send the application form to the opening bank. The opening bank will then open the letter of credit based on the requirements stipulated by the buyer. The opening bank will then send that letter of credit to the nominated bank in the UK. So the bank in India that opened the LC will send the letter of credit to a bank in the UK with whom they have a relationship. And that bank in the UK will check the signatures, the electronic signatures on the LC to make sure they're, to make sure it's a legal letter of credit. Having done that, the nominated bank in the UK will send the letter of credit to the exporter. So the exporter in the UK, they get the letter of credit, and really, really important, they examine it very, very carefully to make sure they can comply with the documentary conditions. Because remember, if there's even the smallest thing they can't comply with, they're not going to get paid. So before they ship the goods, they're going to check it forensically to make sure they can comply. And I always recommend in companies they have 2 people trained to do this, so that one person checks the LC, finds everything's okay, then they give it to someone else to double check. It's a good thing to do because there may be small stipulations that really matter, but it's easy to miss. So I always say in companies, do a double check of the LC before you ship the goods. If there's anything they can't comply with, then they would ask the buyer to issue an amendment. So for example, they get the LC. So, okay, for example, the letter of credit says goods to be shipped no later than, gosh, I'll get this right in a minute. Let me start again. The contract between the seller and buyer says goods to be shipped no later than the 1st of November 2025. That's agreed in the contract. The exporter gets the LC and they look at it and says goods to be shipped no later than the 1st of October 2025. And the seller may say, we can't do that. We can't get the metal ready in time. It won't be ready. And it's not what was agreed in the contract. So the seller would contact the buyer and say, we think you've made a mistake in the LC conditions. You've put goods to be shipped no later than the 1st of October. The agreement in our contract was the 1st of November. So please issue an amendment to the LC, changing 1st of October to 1st of November. The buyer in India would say, really sorry, our mistake on the application form. We will instruct the issuing bank to issue an amendment. So the buyer will instruct the issuing bank to change the clause saying 1st of October as latest shipment to 1st of November. The issuing bank will send the amendment to the nominated bank in the UK, and the nominated bank will send the amendment to the exporter. So the golden rule for the exporter is that you don't ship the goods until you've got a letter of credit that you can comply with. If you have to wait for amendments, you wait for amendments before you ship the goods. So the exporter, they've got an LC, with or without amendments. If they need amendments, they've waited for the amendment, and now they've got an LC that they can comply with. They are then safe to ship the goods. So they dispatch the goods to the buyer, to the importer. The next thing they do is they have to get all the documents together called for in the letter of credit. And they've got to make sure that the documents match the wording on the letter of credit. It's not hard, but there's no grey areas. Whatever the wording is on the LC, that wording is transferred to the documents generated by the seller. So the seller gets all the documents together required by the LC, and they check the documents against the letter of credit to make sure the documents comply. And again, I always say to companies, have a double check. Get 2 people to check the documents against the LC to make sure the documents are compliant. Having ensured the documents are compliant, the exporter then presents the documents to the nominated bank in the UK. The nominated bank in the UK will check the documents against the letter of credit forensically. If the documents comply, the bank in the UK will pay the exporter, or if it's a term payment, they'll payment straight away if it's a site payment. If it's a term payment, in other words, if the exporter is given credit, then they will write to the exporter and say, we've received your documents, we undertake to pay you on the maturity date, and they'll tell them the maturity date for payment. The nominated bank in the UK will then forward the documents to the opening bank in India. The opening bank in India will again check the documents forensically against the LC. And as long as they're happy with the documents, they'll release the documents to the buyer in India, and debit their account if they haven't already done so. The buyer then uses those documents to take delivery of the goods. So the buyer ends up with the goods, the seller ends up with the payment. And as you can see from that, the letter of credit has protected both the buyer and the seller. If the seller can't present the documents listed, they won't get paid. Okay, simple as that. Things can be done to correct that, but we'll talk about that later on. But in effect, if they can't present documents to prove they've carried out the contract and the documents the buyer needs, then quite rightly they won't get paid. If they can prove that by presenting compliant documents, their payment is guaranteed. So, as I say, we've ended up with a payment method protecting both seller and buyer. Okay, any questions on the process? Okay, so a few moments on the different types of LC. I guess the big takeaway here is confirmed and unconfirmed. And the only difference between a confirmed LC and unconfirmed is that with a confirmed LC, if we just go back to the diagram, if, for example, the seller presented correct documents to the nominated bank in the UK, but the opening bank went out of business, okay, and couldn't pay the money to the nominated bank, with a confirmed LC, the nominated bank in the UK would still pay the seller, even though they would know they won't be able to get the money from the opening bank. So the takeaway from that is that if there's deemed to be a high banking risk, if you're selling to a high risk country, you would always want a confirmed letter of credit in case the opening bank fails. But if you're selling to a low risk country, unconfirmed is absolutely fine. There's no problem with it at all. So, for example, if you're a European exporter, if you're selling to the UK, to Canada, to Australia, to most countries in the Middle East, to a lot of countries, to Singapore, to Japan, an unconfirmed LC is fine. And with bank charges, it will be cheaper than a confirmed. But if you're selling to a high risk country like Nigeria, Venezuela, Cambodia, interesting markets, but high risk, you would always want a confirmed LC. So low risk countries, unconfirmed is fine. High risk countries, you would want a confirmed LC. Under the current rules, all letters of credit are deemed to be irrevocable even if they don't say so. And that's good. It means the LC can't be cancelled, it can't be changed, it can't be amended unless both the seller and the buyer agree. So that's good. That's a protection for both parties. LCs are irrevocable even if they don't say so. A revolving letter of credit, that would be a situation where, for example, seller and buyer, they have a 12-month contract to provide the same quantity of materials once a month for 12 months. The same type of material, the same quantity, the same price, once a month for 12 months. And what they could do is they could open a new letter of credit every month. But with a revolving letter of credit, you don't have to do that. With a revolving LC, the seller would ship the goods out for the first month, present documents and get paid, and then the LC would automatically reinstate itself for the second month, when the seller would ship the goods, present the documents and get paid, and then for the third month until the LC expired at the end of the contract period. So that's what a revolving LC is. It simply avoids the need of the buyer to open a new letter of credit every month with something like a 12-month contract. And then we have transferable and back-to-back, typically used by traders. You're buying material in, you're buying minerals in from one party and you're selling them to another party. Okay, so if the party that you're selling to opens the LC as a transferable LC, that means you can transfer part of the proceeds to your supplier. So that can be a very, very good trading tool. You're buying the material for $5,000 and you're selling it for 10,000. So your customer opens the LC for 10,000, 5,000 is transferable to your supplier. Back-to-back LC, it's the same, has the same effect, but it works in a different way. With the back-to-back LC, what actually happens is you get the LC in the normal way from the nominated bank. So you get the standard letter of credit in the normal way, and then you say to the nominated bank, okay, I've got an LC here for 10,000, what did I say, dollars, $10,000 from a buyer in India. I've got to pay a supplier in Zambia $5,000. And using this LC for 10,000, I want you to use this as collateral to open another LC by which I will pay my supplier in Zambia. And that's a back-to-back letter of credit. Because the first letter of credit by which the exporter gets paid from India is used as collateral to back the opening of a second letter of credit to pay the supplier in Zambia. It's a really good financing tool. A standby letter of credit, that's really, it's a credit control tool. And the idea of a standby letter of credit is exactly as it sounds. So if you're trading under open account, you've done your checks, it's a low risk situation. And you decide, okay, low risk country and low commercial risk, we're going to trade with that customer under open account. So you trade with them for a while under open account, they pay you on time, and then you see their payments are getting slower and slower and slower, and you start to worry. They've stopped paying you on time, and you think they may have a problem. So what you can say to them is, okay, you can carry on paying us under open account, but we want you to open a standby letter of credit. And if you fail in a payment, we will use the standby to get paid. So if you then continue trading with them, if they start paying you on time under open account, then you would never use the standby. But if they fail in a payment, you can then get the standby LC out of the drawer and you can use that to get payment. There are special rules for standby LCs, and those rules are called ISP 98, International Standby Practice 98. That's what ISP 98 is. And finally, there are red clause and green clause letters of credit. And with those, they enable the exporter to get a deposit before they ship the goods. So it's a way of getting pre-shipment payment. And typically, you would get a letter of credit in the normal way from the nominated bank. And in a clause traditionally, which would be in red, it may say 10% of this LC value may be claimed immediately. 90% will be payable in the normal way against presentation of documents. So it's purely a way of getting a deposit on the goods if a deposit has been agreed in the contract of sale. That's what a red clause or a green clause is. So those are the main different types of LC. Any questions on any of those? Okay, so the key takeaway there is the most common one, unconfirmed or confirmed. And remember the key takeaway, if you're an exporter selling to a high risk country, you would always want a confirmed LC. If you're selling to a low risk country, unconfirmed is absolutely fine. If you're worried, if you're concerned about whether a country is high risk or low risk, talk to your bank. They have indicators and they would say to you, absolutely, that's low risk, unconfirmed is fine. Or they may say to you, no, trading with that country, you need a confirmed LC. They can guide you. Okay. So with a system, an international system like a letter of credit, there's got to be rules. And with LCs, we have three sets of rules. The main rules are called Uniform Customs and Practice for Documentary Credits. And that's International Chamber of Commerce Publication 600. And we normally abbreviate that to UCP 600. So if anyone says to you UCP 600, those are the set of rules under which all letters of credit will be opened. When you get a letter of credit, it's something to look out for, and it will always be there. It will always say subject to UCP 600. And then you know those rules will apply. Not used very much yet, but if you present electronic documents instead of paper documents, and frankly, the world isn't yet ready for that, but there are a set of rules covering that, and those rules are called the EUCP rules, E for electronic presentation. Now, those rules have been around for about 15 years. They've only been used about 3 times globally. So we're not ready for that yet, but we do have a set of rules for the time when it does become normal to present electronic documents. You know, expectations, we're quite a way away from that at the moment, but the time will come at some stage. And then finally, we have ISBP, or International Standard Banking Practice. And ISBP, they provide the interpretation for the UCP 600 rules. So essentially, we have 3 sets of rules, but the main rules are UCP 600. And the concept of the rules is there must be no grey areas when you deal with a letter of credit. You know, it's all about, do the documents presented by the exporter, do they comply or do they not comply? If they comply, the exporter gets paid. If they don't comply, the exporter doesn't get paid. So the main thrust of the rules is really this whole point. Has the exporter complied with the LC or not? And we can't have grey areas. Okay, so we need to have a very, very prescriptive set of rules. And, you know, we'll look at some of the rules. We haven't got time to go through the whole thing, but we'll look at some of the rules and you can see just how prescriptive the rules are. And I'm going to give you some examples. So, for example, we have a definition. Article 2 is all about definitions. And, you know, it will say things like, if you see the word applicant on an LC, what does that mean? And it will tell you the applicant is the opener of the letter of credit. In other words, the buyer, because they apply for the LC. Now, it's very common now on a letter of credit that you'll be told that you as the exporter will be told to do something within a number of banking days. For example, the LC may say documents to be presented to the nominated bank within 7 banking days of shipment. Okay, that means you've got to present the documents to the bank, to the nominated bank, within 7 days of shipment, 7 banking days. So it's telling you to do it within 7 banking days. So the next question is, what is a banking day? You know, we need to have a definition. Because of course, you know, a banking day in the UK is going to be Monday to Friday. A banking day in Abu Dhabi is going to be Sunday to Thursday. So we need to be clear, and it gives us a definition. It will say a banking day is a day on which the bank is usually open in the country where the activity is to take place. So we have a clear definition of what is required of a banking day. I'm not going to go through all of this in detail because it doesn't matter. I just really want to get you a feel for it. A complying presentation. You know, what is a complying presentation of documents? And it will stipulate that a complying presentation of documents by the exporter is a presentation of documents that meet all the terms and all the conditions of the letter of credit. And it goes on to state, if it is a complying presentation, the bank must pay the exporter. And then we have definitions of some of these strange words: honour, negotiate, and paying. And that's all about when will the exporter get paid? And what is the role of the nominated bank? So it would tell us that, for example, if the nominated bank in the exporter's country is negotiating the letter of credit, that means they will use their own funds to pay the exporter. If they're called the paying bank, that means they'll wait till they get the money from the issuing bank. So the only difference there is that when the exporter receives the LC, if it says payable by negotiation, it means they'll get payment generally within about 24, 48 hours of the bank accepting the documents. If it's the paying bank, they've got to wait till they get the money from the issuing bank, and that could delay the payment by about 24 hours. So there's not very much in it, but it just makes it clear when payments are going to be made. It also states that the issuing bank must honour the LC. A very clear instruction from the opening bank. As long as the documents are correct, they have to pay. They cannot dishonour the LC. You can't have a situation where the buyer says to the bank, oh, don't pay, because the bank will say, we have to. The documents are correct. By law, we have to make the payment. Okay. So then we have Article 3, which is all about interpretation. And, there are some weird things there, but there's a reason for all of them. Look at the first one there. Words in the singular include the plural and the other way around. And the reason they put that in, the rules, is because most letters of credit are issued in English. Now, there's no law that says they have to be. But globally, we're seeing that virtually every letter of credit is issued in English. And in English, if it's not your first language, plurals can be very, very confusing. Is there an S on the end of a word or isn't there? That can be really confusing. And in the past, some banks have rejected documents if there's been an S on the end of the word when there shouldn't be, or if there isn't an S on the end of a word when there should be. So to get over that, under Article 3, it says words in the singular include the plural and the other way round. So, if there isn't an S, if there is an S, it doesn't matter. It's not a discrepancy. Credits are irrevocable, even if unstated. That means that they can't be changed, cancelled, or amended unless both parties agree. That's a good thing. Branches of the same bank in different countries are considered separate banks. So if the LC is opened by HSBC India and it's advised by HSBC UK, they would be treated as separate banks. That's a legal protection, okay? So that if one bank fails, the other bank is deemed not to have failed. So, it's not that important, to be honest, but it is a good legal protection. Then you receive the letter of credit and you're told to carry out an action promptly, immediately, as soon as possible. So documents to be presented immediately after shipment or as soon as possible after shipment. If those words are on the letter of credit, you can completely ignore them because no one knows what they mean. There is no definition for prompt, immediately, as soon as possible. Does it mean within an hour, a minute, a day, a month, a week? No one knows. So that's guidance for the opener, for the buyer. When they open an LC, don't put vague wording in there. Documents to be presented promptly after shipment or immediately after shipment. Be absolutely prescriptive. Documents to be presented within 5 days of shipment or within 10 days. Be clear in what you want. Don't use vague terminology, because if you do use vague terminology, for example, promptly, immediately, as soon as possible, the exporter can completely ignore that requirement. Some documents may have to be signed. So that may sound very, very straightforward. But we need to have a definition of what is a signature. And the rules really do go into that much detail. So it's very, very clear under Article 3. If you have to present a signed document, you can sign it by handwriting, facsimile signature, perforated signature, stamp, symbol, or mechanical or electronic method of authentication. Any one of those means will do as a signature, will be acceptable by the bank. It doesn't have to be a written wet signature. You can use a rubber stamp. If you've got a rubber stamp with your signature on, that will do as a signature. So we have clarity on that. If you're asked to provide a certified or legalized document, unless the LC is more specific, then a requirement for certification or legalization is satisfied by any signature, mark, stamp, or label. Okay, so again, it's really instructing the opener when they open the LC. If you want, for example, a certificate of origin to be certified by a Chamber of Commerce, then you must state that. original certificate of origin certified by an authorised Chamber of Commerce. If you don't state that, if you just ask for a certified certificate of origin, but don't state who must issue it, then that requirement will be satisfied by any signature, mark, stamp, or label. Now, Article 5 is core. It's really the key article in how LCs work. And what Article 5 says is that banks deal with documents and not with the goods, services, or performances to which the documents may relate. So when the bank is checking the documents to decide if they can pay the exporter, all the bank is allowed to do is check the documents against the letter of credit. If the documents comply with the letter of credit, they have to pay the exporter. What the bank is not allowed to do is question the documents. They're not allowed to do that. So, for example, if the LC says goods to be shipped by the 1st of October 2025, the bill of lading is dated the 1st of October 2025, so they've complied with that. The bank is not allowed to say, I don't think that ship sailed on the 1st. I think it sailed on the 2nd. They're not allowed to do that. If the LC calls for a certificate of origin stating the goods are of UK origin, and the exporter issues a certificate of origin stating the goods are of UK origin, the bank is not allowed to say, I don't think the goods are of UK origin. I think that copper came from Zambia. They're not allowed to do that. All they're allowed to do is check the documents against the wording of the LC. So Article 5 is core in the way LCs work. The banks are only allowed to deal with documents. They have no right and no requirement to deal with the goods, services, or performances to which the documents may relate, because they can't. Article 3 is all about availability. There's some detail there. Don't worry too much about that. But the key point there is the 4th bullet point you can see there. Letters of credit are always available with the issuing bank. So the exporter, if they want, can cut out the nominated bank and they can always send the documents directly to the opening bank. They're allowed to do that. But I always say to exporters, don't do it. Always use the nominated bank, because that way, if there's a problem with the documents, you can get them back and you can correct them and represent them. But if the documents are already in India, then there's going to be a big delay and the LC may expire in the meantime. But it is one of the rules that LCs are always available with the issuing bank, and that means if exporters want, they can always present documents directly with the issuing bank. But I stress that is not a good thing to do. The responsibility of the nominated bank, that's in Articles 9 and 10. Under the current rules, it's a new article, and it includes all the details about amendments and things like that. And it also tells the nominated bank that they must satisfy themselves that the letter of credit is authentic before they send it to the exporter. It's not very prevalent now, but in past years, there really have been issues with fraudulent letters of credit. Nowadays, it's fairly rare. 20, 25 years ago, there were quite a lot of them floating around. So because of that, there is a requirement. The nominated bank, they must make sure that the letter of credit is authentic before they send it to the exporter. Article 14 is all about the standard for examination of documents. It's what the bank must check when they're deciding whether to pay the exporter or not. And a lot of that is implemented via international standard banking practice. We'll have a brief look at that in a few minutes. The key takeaway for this is that the banks are only allowed 5 banking days to check the documents. And that means that when the exporter presents documents to the nominated bank, they have 5 banking days to say to the exporter, yeah, the documents are fine, we're going to pay you, or no, we can't pay you because there are discrepancies. And they have to give that within 5 banking days. And the rule is very, very clear. If the bank doesn't advise the exporter, within 5 banking days, then the bank has to pay the exporter. So that's very, very clear. The banks are allowed 5 banking days to check the documents for compliance. The key point here is actually the middle bullet point. You know, the biggest reason why banks reject documents is where documents are not consistent with each other. So, for example, the LC, just to give you an example, maybe the LC is silent about the origin of the goods. It says nothing about the origin of the goods. But it does call for a certificate of origin, and it does call for a commercial invoice. And on the commercial invoice, it shows the origin as UK. On the certificate of origin, it shows the origin as USA. That's an inconsistency. They can't both be right. So that's a really important point, because inconsistency is the biggest reason why banks reject documents, where there are 2 documents presented and they have conflicting information on those documents. In that case, the inconsistency rule will be applied, and that will be a discrepancy. So that's really important. As you can see there, there's also a general requirement that a document presented must appear to fulfill the function of the document. So if the letter of credit calls for a weight note, the document presented must appear to fulfill the function of a weight note. If the LC calls for a clean certificate of inspection, the document presented must appear to fulfill the function of a clean certificate of inspection. The third bullet point there is interesting. For years, there was an argument about whether banks should accept transport documents issued by freight forwarders on behalf of carriers, or only accept documents issued by carriers. There were big arguments about that. So in the current rules, they've made it very, very clear. The issuer of a transport document, like a bill of lading, an airway bill, a road consignment note, the issuer of a transport document requirement does allow MVOCC and freight forwarders documents. In other words, they don't have to be issued by the carrier. They may be issued by a freight forwarder on behalf of the carrier. Article 15 is a new article in the current rules, and it's all about what the nominated bank must do once they've determined that the presentation of documents complies with the letter of credit. I mean, the banks know what they've got to do, but it's now enshrined in the rules. So you present documents to the nominated bank, and it's very, very clear. The nominated bank checks the documents. They find out they're compliant. It's very, very clear they must honour or negotiate. In other words, they must pay the exporter. It's also very clear they must then forward the documents to the opening bank. Now, they know they've got to do that, but as I say, it's now enshrined in the rules. Article 16 is all about discrepant documents. The banks can't just say to you, we're not going to pay you because the documents are discrepant. They've got to give a proper refusal notice pointing out what the discrepancies are, so that hopefully you can correct them. So Article 16 is again for the nominated bank, and it tells them if you're refusing a presentation of documents because of discrepancies, you've got to be very, very clear what the discrepancies are, so that hopefully the exporter can correct the documents and re-present them. Because remember, the exporter owns the documents until they've been paid. So even though they've been presented to the nominated bank, until payment's been agreed, those documents are owned by the exporter, which is a good protection for the exporter. Now, some documents will have to be presented in original, other documents in copy. So we need to have an interpretation. What is an original document? It sounds very straightforward, but we need to have a clear interpretation. Article 17 gives us just that. It gives us the interpretation. And it will tell us that a document will be treated as an original if it meets any one of these requirements. Firstly, if it's got an original signature, it will be deemed to be an original document. Or if it's got the word original on it and it doesn't appear to be a copy, it would deem to be an original document. If it's handwritten, it will be deemed to be an original document. If it's on the issuer's note paper, if it's on their official note paper, even if it's not signed, even if it's not marked as original, if it's on original note paper, it will be deemed to be original. And finally, if any of you at all still have a typewriter, if you do still have a typewriter, you win a prize, but it will tell you that the top typed copy will be deemed to be an original. So any one of those things will constitute an original document. It goes on to say that even if the letter of credit doesn't call for it, at least one original of each document must be presented. So, for example, if the LC says 5 packing lists, at least one of those packing lists must be an original. It's easy to do. You just write the word original on one of them or 2 of them. It doesn't matter. If the LC calls for copy documents, you can always present originals instead of copies, but you can't present copies instead of originals. That stands to reason. So we have a very, very clear definition of what constitutes an original document. Then commercial invoices. You know, LCs can call for a bundle of different documents, but the document which will always be required will be the commercial invoice. And the key point there is the second bullet point. Every letter of credit will give a brief description of the goods as agreed in the sales contract. It won't give a whole long description. There'll be a brief description. But the description of the goods on the letter of credit must be exactly the same on the commercial invoice, because that's the legal proof that the exporter has shipped the correct goods. It's easy to do. You know, the exporter, when they're preparing their invoices, they just copy the description on the LC onto their invoices. Then they know they're giving a correct description. But it's a really important point that the description of the goods on the commercial invoice must be exactly the same description as on the letter of credit. We then have a bundle of articles all about the different kinds of transport documents and how they must be generated, how they must be presented. So if it's multimodal shipping, for example, a door-to-door container shipment, Article 19 gives the instructions on what that document must look like. If it's a port-to-port bill of lading or non-negotiable way bill, then Articles 20 and 21 apply. And they include things like the name of the captain of the ship doesn't have to be shown, it's not important, but there must be conditions of carriage. Think back to yesterday. So the conditions of carriage must be on the transport document. If they're not on the transport document, then the transport document must give a website from which the conditions of carriage can be extracted. So Articles 20 and 21 are all about the content of bills of lading and non-negotiable way bills. Article 22 is interesting. Charter party bills of lading. So if the seller has chartered a ship to ship the goods to the buyer, and one of the documents that has to be presented is a charter party bill of lading, the banks will not examine the detail of the charter party bill of lading. All the banks will do is make sure it's there. Okay, and that's simply because charter party bills of lading, they're complicated. You can't expect the banks to understand them. So if the LC calls for a charter party bill of lading, all the bank will do is make sure it's there. They'll make sure it's been presented, but they won't check the detail. Article 23 is all about airway bills, what's expected if an airway bill has to be presented. Article 24 is all about road, rail or inland waterway documents. Article 25 is all about courier receipts. And Article 26 is about on-deck shipment. So let's think about steel. There's an issue here. because Article 26 is very clear. If a bill of lading says the goods have been shipped on deck, that would be a discrepancy. The banks will not accept a bill of lading saying the goods are shipped on deck. The reason for that is if the goods are on the deck of the ship, they are deemed to be vulnerable. Now, the problem you've got when you deal with commodities, that very often with commodities like steel, they will actually be loaded on deck. So in that case, when the buyer opens the LC, they have to expressly modify Article 26. And what they would have to do when they open the LC is they would have to override it and put a clause in saying, notwithstanding Article 26 of UCP 600, we will accept bills of lading stating the goods have been shipped on deck. We will accept that. Then you've got over that problem. Similarly, with clean transport documents, when the shipping lines or any carrier, when they receive goods for transport, they will always check the condition as far as they can. And if they think on receipt there's something wrong with the condition of the goods, they will put a clause on the bill of lading. Maybe something like the goods appear to be damaged, or the goods appear to have insufficient packaging, and that protects the shipping line. And that would be called a claused bill of lading. If the bill of lading is claused, the bank will not accept it. The bank will only accept clean transport documents. And again, you can have a problem. For example, something like steel. The problem with steel is it always goes rusty when it gets near the sea. So again, this is a situation when the buyer opens the LC, they have to issue a caveat, notwithstanding Article 27, we will accept a bill of lading stating that the steel is rusty. Rust on the steel will be acceptable to us. So that's how you get over something like that. Article 28 covers the insurance document, remembering that if it's a CIP or CIF transaction, there will be a requirement to present the insurance document, only if it's a CIP or CIF transaction. So Article 28 gives the rules for insurance documents. It says that policies can be presented instead of insurance certificates. And it also says any exclusion clauses will be acceptable, which is, a little bit strange, but that's what the rules say. As long as the insurance document is there, even if there are loads of exclusions on it, the bank will accept it. So any exclusions will be acceptable. Article 23 is hours of presentation, and it basically says that banks are only obliged to accept documents received within their normal banking hours. So, for example, in the UK, normal banking hours are 9:30 to 3:30, and that means the banks are not obliged to accept documents in the UK after 3:30. Probably they would accept them, but they're not obliged to do so. Article 36 is about force majeure. There we go. We then have EUCP, as I'd mentioned, not used very often, in fact, only used a few times in the last 15 years. But when the world of international trade does go digital, EUCP gives the rules for electronic presentations, electronic documents. There's only 10 articles in it, and it covers things like what constitutes an original document if it's an electronic document, or what constitutes a signature on an electronic document. So that's EUCP. I wouldn't worry too much about that now. We're not ready for that yet, unfortunately, but in the years to come, EUCP will become increasingly important. We then have international standard banking practice. International standard banking practice gives the interpretation for the UCP rules. And we have an introduction to ISBP, and basically in the introduction it tells us that the practices described in this publication highlight how the articles of UCP are to be interpreted and applied, to the extent that the terms and conditions of the letter of credit or any amendments thereto do not expressly modify or exclude any applicable article. So, it's a bit strange wording, but it's basically saying, okay, UCP 600, the wording is very, very legal wording. So in this publication, we're giving the interpretations. And they don't hold back. So in the scope, it's under ISBP, it states many of the problems that arise at the document examination stage, in other words, when the bank checks the documents, many of the problems could be avoided or resolved by the respective parties through careful attention to detail in the letter of credit or in any amendments to them. And it goes on to say the applicant and the beneficiary, in other words, the buyer and the seller, should carefully consider the documents required for presentation, by whom they're to be issued, their data content, and the time frame in which they're to be presented. In other words, when the exporter gets the LC, for every document the exporter must present, it must be very, very clear from the letter of credit by whom that document must be issued, the data content of the document, and the time frame in which it must be presented. No grey areas. It must be very, very clear to the exporter what they have to do in relation to that document. In part 7 of the scope, it also makes it very clear, and this is pretty important, that a letter of credit should never require presentation of a document that has to be issued, signed, or countersigned by the buyer. If there is such a requirement, the beneficiary should consider the appropriateness of such a requirement and determine its ability to comply with it or seek a suitable amendment. Now, that's very important because one of the principles of letters of credit is that the documents should be within the control of the exporter. And if there's a requirement on the letter of credit that the exporter must present a document which is provided by the buyer, if the buyer doesn't give that document to the exporter can't get paid. Or if they delay in giving that document to the exporter can't get paid. So there should never be a requirement, for example, there should never be a requirement that the exporter, the seller, must present an acceptance certificate issued by the buyer, because that means the seller's going to have to wait till the goods arrive, typically under a D Incoterm. They're going to have to wait till the goods arrive and then trust the buyer to issue an acceptance certificate and send it back to them so that they can present it to the bank to get paid. So that's why I think you may remember from last week, you can't use a D Incoterm with a letter of credit. It doesn't work. Okay, so key takeaway there from a seller's point of view is never accept a requirement where you have to present a document which has to be provided by, signed or countersigned by the buyer. ISBP gets updated very regularly. Whenever there's a query, for example, the seller presents documents to a bank, the bank says we can't pay you, there are discrepancies, the seller doesn't agree there are discrepancies, the ICC may be asked for a decision. And those decisions become part of international standby practice. Because of that, ISBP is updated fairly regularly. The last update was in 2023, and you can see there that there are some really detailed updates in standard banking practice. Because of time, I'm not going to go through all of them, but just to look at a couple of them, it gives you an example of the level of detail. So, for example, it says the abbreviation IND can be used instead of the word industries. So if the LC has the word industries and the exporter doesn't put industries, they put IND on the document, that's absolutely acceptable. There's nothing wrong with that. That's a decision that they've made. If you look a bit further down, copies of documents don't have to be signed. They've made it absolutely clear in ISBP, if it's a copy document, it does not need a signature. Then if we go a bit further, an invoice presented under a letter of credit issued is, let me start again. An invoice presented under a letter of credit issued in US dollars. bearing only the dollar sign. It doesn't say US, it just has the dollar sign without any further qualification, fulfills the requirement of UCP 600 sub-article 18A3 unless data in the invoice itself or another presented document implies that the dollar sign may refer to a currency other than dollars. So again, it's a bit long-winded, but it's very, very clear there that unless the LC says something different, if the US dollar symbol is used, but it doesn't say the word US, it doesn't matter. It will be deemed to be US dollars. So again, I think you can see here that ISBP, it stays up to date and it really does go into a lot of detail. And it gives some general principles. Generally accepted abbreviations may be used on documents. For example, CO instead of company, INTL instead of international, as we've seen, IND instead of industries. So generally accepted abbreviations are fully acceptable on documents presented. Certificates must be signed. And you've got some other detail there. Again, because of time, I'm not going to go through a huge amount of detail. Third bullet point there is quite interesting, isn't it? The fact that a document has a box in it, a field or a space for data to be inserted doesn't necessarily mean that completion is essential. So if you look, for example, at a bill of lading has a lot of boxes on them, a lot of spaces, a lot of fields, but you don't fill every box in, every field in for every shipment. The bill of lading will have a space for final delivery point, but if it's not a door-to-door delivery, then that box won't be completed. So just because a document has a field in it, or a space or a box, it doesn't necessarily mean something has got to be in there. Again, you can see how much detail there is there. Where a letter of credit requires a document to be issued by a named person or a named entity, the condition is satisfied where the document appears is the important word, where the document appears to be issued by the named person or entity by use of its letterhead, or where there is no letterhead when the document appears to have been completed or signed by the named person or entity. So in that principle, the important word is appeared. If there's a signature on it, the bank has no idea who signed the document. They've got no idea. So as long as it appears to have been issued or signed by the person stipulated in the LC, the bank will accept it. Third bullet point here is quite interesting. Where the presented documents indicate mathematical calculations, banks only determine that stated totals do not conflict with the credit or any other document. In other words, the banks are not allowed to check your mathematical calculations. All they're allowed to do, for example, if there's 10 different kinds of metal on the invoice, the shipment is 10 different kinds of metal, and you've got each type of metal as a separate line on the invoice, the bank is not allowed to check your mathematics in the adding up. All they're allowed to do is check the totals, agree with the letter of credit, or do not conflict with the LC. They're not allowed to check your mathematic calculations. And again, the first bullet point here is, I spoke about this earlier on. There's a myth that if the exporter makes a mistake in a document, they won't get paid. If they make a spelling mistake, they won't get paid. And it's very, very clear in the rules. A misspelling or a typing error that does not affect the meaning of a word or the sentence in which it occurs does not make a document discrepant. For example, the goods are machines. But on a document, it says M-A-S-H-I-N-E. It should have been M-A-C-H-I-N-E. Okay, it's clearly a spelling mistake. Someone's put an S in there. It should have been a C. That is not a discrepancy. It's clearly a spelling mistake. The bank is not allowed to reject the document because of that. However, if the goods description was model 123, it was model 321, and the document said model 123, that is clearly a discrepancy because it's a conflict in data. It could be something completely different. And the other point there is interesting as well. Whenever you're asked to do something, on a letter of credit, it should always ask for a document to prove it. If it doesn't ask for a document to prove it, it's a non-documentary condition, and the exporter can ignore it. So, for example, the contract says all the goods must be packed in green boxes. That's agreed in the contract. When the exporter gets the LC will probably say, all the goods under this contract must be packed in green boxes and a certificate to this effect is required. And the exporter presents a certificate. We hereby certify we've packed the goods in green boxes. They've certified they've done it. However, if the LC doesn't call for a certificate, if it only says goods to be packed in green boxes, full stop, it doesn't ask for a document, it's a non-documentary condition, and the exporter can completely ignore that condition because it's non-documentary. And the whole concept of a letter of credit is that it's all about documents. It's about documents proving the exporter has done what they're contractually required to do. And as you can see, quite a lot of detail there. Signatures don't have to be handwritten. Documents can be titled as called for in the letter of credit. They can have a similar title or they can be untitled. So if you're asked to present a packing list, my recommendation is call the document a packing list. Then there's no question about it. However, if you call it a packing note or you don't call it anything, but it appears to be a packing list, the bank has to accept it. But my guidance there is if they ask for a packing list, call it a packing list, and then the bank won't query it. And we get clauses covering all the different kinds of documents you may be asked to present. So ISBP, International Standard Banking Practice, it gives a huge amount of detail on the requirements of UCP 600, essentially on the requirements of different documents that you may be required to present. Okay, let me pause there. We've done a quick run through there. Any questions on the rules? Okay, so just a few things on good practice. If you're the exporter, you can leave it to your customer to open the letter of credit and they can, check on the documents required. They can do their checks and open it. But it's good practice to guide the customer. If they're not used to opening LCs, work with them, because once they've opened the letter of credit with the bank, if anything needs changing, you've got to get an official amendment and then it starts costing money. It's much, much better to work with the buyer, work with the opener on agreeing the documents required to be presented. That's always a good thing to do. Remember, as an exporter, always check the LC on receipt before you ship the goods. Always make sure you can comply. If there's anything you can't comply with, you ask for an amendment to the LC. You don't ship the goods until you receive the amendment in your office. That's important. And also remember, before you ship the goods, before you present the documents to the nominated bank, do a forensic check of the documents to make sure they comply with the wording, the terms and conditions of the letter of credit. So from the exporter's point of view, we have prescriptive rules for handling compliant presentations. There's been a reduction in the timescale that banks are allowed to check the documents. So that's pretty good for the exporter. It's quite a liberal regime from the exporter's perspective. If you think back, a signature, what constitutes a signature? One of a bundle of things. What constitutes an original document? One of a bundle of things. So it's quite a liberal regime. But do remember, if the importer is asking for documents, there's a reason why they're asking for them. The documents must be fit for purpose. And as long as the buyer knows what they're doing, when they open the LC, they will be asking for documents which they need for customs requirements, regulatory requirements, to give them the right to take delivery of the goods when the goods arrive, for example, a bill of lading, and if it's a CIP or CIF transaction, to prove the goods have been insured up to the correct level. So the goods presented, the the buyer isn't just asking for them to be a nuisance, they're asking for them because they need those documents for a reason. Also remember, when the buyer opens the LC, and this will depend a lot on their standing with the bank, on their credit worthiness. But remember, if they're, things are a bit bumpy with them and their bank, with their cash flow, then the bank may say to them, okay, we'll open the LC, but we want the money first. So, that's going to be detrimental for the buyer because it means they're going to have to put the money down before the bank opens the letter of credit. And it's going to be a long time before you get the letter of credit, you ship the goods, they receive the goods. So, they're putting the money down quite a long time before they actually get value from the product. But that's a reality. If they're not credit worthy, that's a good reason why you would want a letter of credit. But it's always important to bear in mind, because that can be the start of a negotiation. The fact that they will have to put down the money early. And it's just something to keep at the back of your mind. When banks reject documents, there can be a lot of reasons for that. And I'm just going to give you some examples here, but there can be loads and loads of reasons why the banks reject documents. These are the reasons that come up more prolifically than any other reasons. So inconsistency, I spoke about that earlier, where you've got two documents presented and there's a difference in the information on the documents. One of the documents says the goods are UK origin, the other document says USA. Or one document says the goods weigh 5,000 kilos, the other document says the goods weigh 5,001 kilos. The bank won't just say, it's only 1 kilo difference. They'll say they can't both be right. That's a discrepancy. Only one of those documents can be right. So the golden rule for the exporter is, before you present documents to the nominated bank, you check the documents against the letter of credit, but you also check the documents against each other for consistency. That's a really important thing to do. UCP 600 is very, very clear on what the signature block on transport documents should look like, whether it's an airway bill, a bill of lading, a charter bill of lading. UCP is very clear on that. Sometimes the documents are wrong. The exporter gets it wrong. Very often nowadays, LCs will give a time constraint for presentation of documents, and they will say something like documents to be presented within 10 days of shipment, or within 20 days, or within 3 days, or within 5 days. But generally, there will be a stipulation. If you present documents after the presentation time, then clearly that's going to be a discrepancy. If you don't present all the documents required, of course, that's going to be a discrepancy. If a document should be marked as original and it isn't, that's a discrepancy. If you try and present documents after the expiry date, of course, that's a discrepancy. When the LC's expired, it's dead. There's nothing else you can do with it at all. It's completely dead. So don't try and present documents after the expiry date, because there's no point in doing that. Some documents have to be endorsed. In other words, they have to be signed on the back. Easy to forget to do that. Normally, it's going to be bills of lading or insurance documents. If you forget to do it and the LC calls for it, then clearly you won't get paid. If the description of the goods on the invoice is different to the description on the LC, that's a discrepancy. You won't get paid. Because remember, the description on the invoice is your legal proof you're selling the goods agreed in the contract. The description of the goods agreed in the contract will be transposed on the LC. So that description should be on the commercial invoice. If it's not, then that's going to be a discrepancy. If a document that you haven't generated yourself, like a shipping line bill of lading, if it's altered, the alteration must be authenticated. If it's not authenticated, that's a discrepancy. Late shipment, every letter of credit will give a latest date of shipment. If, for example, the LC says latest date of shipment 1st of October 2025 and the bill of lading is dated the 2nd of October 2025, that would be late shipment. That's going to be a discrepancy. So, there's no grey areas. The bank can't say, it's just a day late, we'll accept that. They're not allowed to do that. It's the rule of strict compliance. Okay, there's no grey area. There's no they can't say, well, it's just a little bit different to what the LC is calling for. The bank isn't allowed to do that. The document is either compliant or it's not. That's all there is to it. So remember, the presentation to the nominated bank. The presentation must be complete, compliant, correct, and consistent. If the documents are not complete, compliant, correct, and consistent, they're discrepant, and then payment will not be made. So these are key things to remember. You present the documents to the nominated bank. If the documents are compliant, assuming you're the exporter in this example, you, the exporter, gets paid and the buyer gets the documents through the banking system, and therefore the buyer gets the goods. If the documents are discrepant, you don't get paid, but the buyer doesn't get the documents and they can't get the goods. And that protects the seller. So if the documents are discrepant, then the seller doesn't get paid, but they still own the goods. The goods are on the way to India by then, so they're going to have to get them back or find another buyer, but at least they've still got the goods. So that's the situation. So if you present documents to the nominated bank and they're discrepant, okay, the best thing to do is, if you can correct the mistakes, is get the documents back from the bank and correct them and represent them if you can do that before the LC expires. So the bank says to you, really sorry, there's an error in the document. And you look at it and say, oh, yeah, we can correct that. You would say to the bank, return the documents to us, we'll correct them, we'll represent them before expiry. So the exporter gets the documents back, they correct the mistakes, they represent, and they get paid. But not all things are correctable. Maybe it's late shipment. Maybe the LC says goods to be shipped by the 1st of October, bill of lading says 2nd of October. That would be late shipment. The exporter, there's nothing they can do. You can't correct that. So the next action will be the seller, the exporter, will say to the bank, okay, please get permission from the buyer to accept the discrepancies. And the nominated bank in the UK, in the example we had, will contact the bank in India and say, LC number 123456. Nominated bank, we have noted the following discrepancy. Please ask the opener, in other words, the buyer, if they will accept the discrepancy. So the issuing bank, the opening bank, will contact the buyer, the exporter's customer, and say to them, we have noted the following discrepancy, late shipment. LC stated goods to be shipped by 1st of October. Bill of lading has stated 2nd of October. Will you accept that discrepancy? If they accept it, the exporter gets paid and the buyer gets the documents and the goods. If they don't accept it, the exporter doesn't get paid, but the buyer doesn't get the goods. So the buyer's going to, they're going to want to know what the discrepancies are, and they'll look at the kind of things you can see on the screen at the moment. Is the discrepancy because the invoice suggests they're the wrong goods? Well, if the invoice is wrong, the goods description doesn't match the LC, the buyer may say, well, those are not the goods I've ordered, and they probably would not accept that discrepancy. If the letter of credit calls for a clean inspection certificate, saying the goods are of the ordered quality, but the inspection certificate issued by Intertek says the goods are substandard, they don't meet the specification of the contract of sale, then the buyer may not accept that. So, and also, if the discrepancy is that they haven't got the documents required for clearance, that means they can't take delivery of the goods. That means they're not going to accept that discrepancy. So a sensible buyer is going to have a close look at what the discrepancies are before they just say, yeah, we'll accept the discrepancy or we won't accept it. They'll look at what the discrepancies are and then they'll make a decision. If they don't accept the discrepancy, exporter doesn't get paid, but they can't get the goods. The exporter still owns the goods. And, in reality, most discrepancies are pretty small. They tend not to be major things. Maybe they're 1 day late in shipment, something like that. So if it's a small discrepancy, in most cases, the buyer will accept the discrepancies. So if there are discrepancies, there are various things the seller can do, but it's really just the first two that are the sensible things to do. Ideally, as I've mentioned, the seller should amend the documents, they should correct them and then represent them to the bank. If they can't do that, then through the banking system, they have to get the buyer's permission to accept the discrepancies and thus to authorize payment. So it's normally going to be one of those two things that's going to happen. Sometimes the nominated bank may say, okay, we've got your documents, they're discrepant, but don't worry, we will send the documents on collection to the bank in India. Never let them do that if you're the exporter. That simply means you lose the protection of the LC and they're purely treating the transaction as a documentary collection. You've lost all protection of the letter of credit. Banks often say that with discrepancies. Don't let them do that. Always say, no, don't send it as a collection. Ask for the buyer's permission to accept the discrepancies. And again, the bottom bullet point there, it's fairly rare, but I put it there for the sake of completeness. In very, very unusual situations, for example, if the nominated bank coincidentally is the same bank as the seller holds their account, which would be a complete coincidence. But if it is the same bank, and that bank rejects the documents, they say the documents are discrepant, then the seller could say, well, what about if we issue you an indemnity in case you can't get repaid, will you pay us now? Now, that kind of indemnity is very, very rare. It's very unusual. I've purely put it there for the sake of completeness. But as I say, normally, if there are discrepancies, it's going to be one of the first 2 points there. Amend the documents and represent them, or get the buyer's permission to accept the discrepancies. What to do if things go wrong? You may have a dispute, you may present documents to a bank, and the bank isn't always right. Sometimes they get it wrong. So the bank says, we can't pay you because of discrepancies. You say to them, I don't think they are discrepancies. I think that you should be paying us. I checked with UCP, I checked with ISBP, I don't think those are discrepancies. If you get into a dispute, you can use a solicitor, but better than that, you can go to the International Chamber of Commerce Court of Arbitration, and they will hear the case for you. And within the International Chamber of Commerce, they also have the DocDex rules, and those are specifically for letter of credit disputes. So in that kind of situation, you present documents, the nominated bank says, we can't pay you due to discrepancies. You say, we've checked with UCP, we don't believe they are discrepancies, you need to pay us. The bank says, we think they're discrepancies. Then you can make an agreement to get a DocDex ruling. You send the case to DocDex, ICC experts will look at it and they'll say, yep, the bank is right, that is a discrepancy. Or they'll say, no, the exporter is right, that's not a discrepancy, the bank must pay the exporter. And those are called the DocDex rules. It's a dispute resolution service. So those are letters of credit. There we go. And I haven't left as much time as I hoped to. It is quite an involved subject, but we've got a bit of time. So any questions or comments? Either about payments and letters of credit that we've spoken about today, or anything that we've spoken about in the 4 modules. Any questions at all?
Just if a letter of credit can't be honoured because, say, quality's off, is there normally a mechanism for a renegotiation, or would that have to go back to a sort of lose the letter of credit and some kind of direct agreement?
It would, yeah. So if you had a situation, for example, where the contract stated there's going to be pre-shipment inspection of the goods, and of course that will be on the letter of credit when it's opened. Goods subject to pre-shipment inspection, a clean report of inspection showing the goods are of ordered quality, grade, quantity must be presented. And the inspector inspects the goods and says they're not up to the right quality. I can't issue a clean report of inspection. It's going to be a non-negotiable or a qualified report of inspection. Then clearly that's not going to be acceptable to the bank. So before the goods are shipped, then probably what's going to happen is the exporter is going to get in touch with the importer and say, look, the goods are of slightly different specification. Will you accept this slight difference in the in the specification? And the buyer may say, they'll say yes or no. If they say no, we won't, then it may be that the exporter has got to completely, ship a nut. I mean, by that stage they won't have shipped the goods yet, so they may have to say, well, have we got goods which are the right quality, and then we'll get those inspected, and we'll get a clean inspection certificate. Or quite rightly, as you say, there may be some negotiation. If I'm the buyer, I may say, okay, actually, I can see from the, I can see that the goods aren't of the right quality. It's not much different. I will accept that quality, but they may say to the exporter, of course, we want a rebate from you, or we want 20% off the next order or something like that. So absolutely, it's likely to lead to some kind of negotiation. Does that answer that okay?
Yes, thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. Any questions or comments? So on today, or as I say, what we've covered previously in the 4 sessions.
Again, if you have any questions, and you are also welcome to put them in the chat, and I will pass them on. Thank you.
So as this is the last session, we need to see now if there's anything in the chat. Let's just have a quick look.
I think at the moment
I
there
think
isn't.
nothing in there. Okay.
But if anybody wants to ask questions or explore scenarios where there is a problem with the contract, then this is your chance to ask them now.
I know, in the 4 sessions, there's a huge amount of information that we pass over. So what I always say to people is don't worry about the detail. You'll get copies of the slides. The idea is to give you an overview of the 4 main elements of international trade transactions. Think back to day 1, commercial, transport, regulatory, and finance. Every transaction will have those four elements. And I hope, this has given you an overview to them. And, there's quite a lot more detail in the slides when you get copies of the slides. All of it is there. It is a lot of technical information. You're not expected to remember everything. Of course, you're not. But I think what you will find is, once you sit back a little bit and kind of, when you have a moment, have a look through the slides, and hopefully everything will fall into place for you. But anything else at all?
I think, John, this particular area is the case where a lot of disputes arise. They arise between the buyer and seller, they can arise between the bank and the beneficiary. So I guess a question is, are there any recent cases that you can think of that might be interesting in this context?
I mean, there are
developments or in disputes.
On payments.
Yeah, on payments.
Oh, Helena, there are loads of them. At the moment, I think I haven't got the. Currently, I'm doing expert witness on about 7 or 8 court cases concerning payments, where there've been disputes between banks, between exporters, sometimes between importers as well. There are loads of them, and I always find it frustrating. I mean, I do quite a lot of this work on behalf of clients in court cases, and honestly, it can be really frustrating because. And this isn't me being unkind, this is a reality. If only the disputing parties read the rules. If only they knew they had the Incoterms book, they looked at the Incoterms. If they're getting paid by LLC, they have UCP 600. You could really avoid so many of the disputes. And I mean, there was a recent, in fact, last year I was in Singapore for a court case there. And, it was honestly, it was a dispute that should never have gone to court. It really shouldn't have done. It was a bank in Singapore that didn't pay the exporter under an LC. And the reason was the bank said that the bill of lading had a date of shipment which complied with the LC, but the bank said, we don't believe the ship sailed on that date. Now, the rules are very clear. The bank has no right to sell that, to say that. If the bill of lading has a date, the bank has to accept that. If that date agrees with the LC says shipment no later than a date, and the date on the bill of lading is within the time period, the bank has to accept it. This bank didn't. They just said, we don't think the ship sailed on that date. It was crazy. The rules are very clear about that. And I couldn't believe it. It went to court in Singapore. I couldn't believe they wanted a face-to-face hearing. So, and it all happened very quickly. So I had to rush out to Singapore for a court case which lasted about 5 minutes. And it was so straightforward. The two sides, the barristers, they read the case. And then the judge looked at me as the person giving, it's an awful term, but in most countries they call it expert witness. The judge looked at me and said, okay, the judges aren't experts on these things. And the judge said to me, are there any rules about these letter of credit things? And I said, yep, the rules are called UCP 600. And the judge said, is there a rule that can be applied in this particular case? And I said, yep, Article 5. And I had my UCP 600 with me. I gave it to the judge. He looked at Article 5 and, the case lasted about 4 minutes. He said to the bank, Article 5 is very, very clear. You have to accept the document as presented if it meets the requirement of the LC. And he just looked at the bank's barrister and he said, you must instruct the bank. They must pay the exporter today. They must pay the court charges. They must pay for the expert witness. And they must pay a fine as well for wasting the court's time. It cost the bank a fortune for something which was really clear in the rules. So that's just one example. But yeah, it happens over and over again. And when we talk about letters of credit, I always say to exporters is if a bank tells you documents are discrepant, never believe them until you've checked yourself. And the reason I say that is because there's a feeling if the bank says it, it must be right. But that isn't the case. Now, don't get me wrong. Most of the time banks are very professional and they know what they're doing. But it's estimated that 40% of the time with letters of credit, when the bank rejects documents, it's estimated that 40% of the time the bank is wrong, but the seller hasn't got the confidence to challenge the bank. The seller assumes the bank is right, when 40% of the time the bank is wrong. So, when I train companies in using letters of credit, most of the reason is to give them the confidence to challenge a bank if the bank says, okay, we've got the documents, but we can't pay you, there are discrepancies. And the exporter wrongs over because they don't know any different, whereas the bank may well be wrong. So yeah, it's honestly, it's prevalent. It really is a very big problem.
John, could you go over again that point that you made about modifying
Yes.
the Article
Yeah.
26 and the fact that the bank is in the right not to accept it
Sure.
if it is
Sure.
modified. So can you just go over that again?
Yeah, definitely. So with every letter of credit, it will be subject to the rules. It will be subject to the USP 600 rules. But there may be things that it's impossible to comply with. So, for example, if you're talking about a big consignment of bulk goods, not containerized, but bulk goods, they may go on the deck of the ship. That's fairly normal. But the rules are very, very clear. If a bill of lading says shipped on deck, the bank will not accept that. That's a discrepancy. So if the transaction is such, the commodity is such, that it's very, very clear the goods may be shipped on deck, or they will be shipped on deck, then when the opener opens the letter of credit, they have to instruct the bank, the opening bank, to override Article 26. And they put a clause on the LC which will say something like, notwithstanding Article 26, we will accept a bill of lading stating the goods have been shipped on deck. Or, if it's covering something like steel, we will accept a bill of lading saying that goods have, having a clause on them, If it's not a clean bill of lading, if it's a clause bill of lading saying the steel is rusty, we will accept that because we know the steel is going to go rusty. So that's what's meant by express modification. If there's anything where the standard rules can't apply when the LC is opened, then the opener must make sure that the clauses, the articles of UCP, are overridden so that the letter of credit can actually work.
Can a bank legally, retrospectively, not accept that modification if they have accepted it?
No, I mean, once they've accepted it, they can't go back on that.
Okay.
So once they've accepted that, that will be inherent in the letter of credit. Letters of credit are irrevocable. That's a really important word, irrevocable. So LCs are irrevocable. They can't be changed, cancelled, or amended unless all parties agree. And that's why it's great that under the current rules, even if the letter of credit doesn't say it's irrevocable, it will be deemed to be irrevocable, and the bank can't just change something at a whim. Now, if they do decide that they don't want to honour that, then they could negotiate with the parties and say, we don't want to honour that. And if all parties agree, then they could remove it. But unless all parties agree, then it stays in the letter of credit. Dare I say it, it's very democratic.
Thank you, John.
I'm not sure that's the right word, but nevertheless.
Does anyone have any other questions? Okay, Dana.
Yeah, Dana, please. Oh, we can't hear you. You're on mute, I think.
Yes, sorry.
That's
I just
okay.
want to say I'm new at this, as I think Paulina knows, but so it's so much detail. So I was very reassured that Jonathan said not to worry so much about the detail. And I think by osmosis, some of it is sinking in.
Yeah.
So thank you, Jonathan, and thank you for having this seminar. It was really perfect for me as a beginner with this. Thank you.
Oh, I'm so pleased. I mean, sorry, I interrupted, Paulina, but no, I'm so pleased. And don't worry about the detail. The detail is in the slides. You can refer to, what I do is I've tried to put together the slides so that in time you can refer back to them and it gives you the detail that you need. Don't worry about the detail. Dinah, honestly, if you're walking away with an overview and you feel a little bit better informed than you were 2 weeks ago, then you should feel very achieved by that, and I would feel very happy with that. Absolutely.
Since I will also be providing the recording of yesterday's session and today, you can always rewatch it and,
you can listen over and over again.
Indeed.
Especially if you have nothing else to do, right?
Yeah. What better way to spend your weekend?
Yeah. John, may I ask you a sweeping sort of question?
Yeah.
Just because I have observed it so often happening in our trade. Let's say a customer prepays for shipment and the shipment for supply and it never turns up. Sometimes it is just the supply just, backtracks on the contract. Sometimes, perhaps prices rise in the interim and they backtrack with it for whatever reason, or their supply chain breaks down somewhere along the way, as happened, for example, in armed conflicts recently. Somebody ordered something from Russia and it can't arrive. So if the goods are not delivered, what avenues are open to the buyer in this situation? And I know there are multiple ones.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the first thing, it's this is the danger of paying in advance, and frankly, it's always so. When I train buyers specifically, I would always say to them, "Don't pay in advance, whatever you do. This is the danger." So, what can they do about it? Well, the first thing, of course, is they'll negotiate with the seller and say, "Look, you haven't shipped the goods. We want our money back." That's the first thing. They could try. Otherwise, all they can do is go legal. That's all they can do. There's no other option. And that's really what the very big danger is, because bad things happen. Unfortunately, they do happen. Prices can crash. As you quite rightly say, there can be conflict. And you have these logistic challenges that we seem to have had so many of them recently. The Red Sea closing, the Panama Canal running out of water, the ship, the Ever Given, blocking the Suez Canal. Things can go wrong. They can go wrong. And that's the really big danger for a buyer for paying in advance. So that's really all they can do. Hopefully the seller would be honourable and say, look, we haven't been able to ship, have the money back. Or otherwise, the only other way is by legal redress. That's the only other way to do it.
And we via the MMTA we do offer services like mediation and arbitration, so that people can
Yeah,
settle their disputes
and
without
sure.
going to court.
Yeah, and that's
But
a good point, Pauline. And what I would always say is, the International Chamber of Commerce, for international trade, it's the ICC that have the best arbitration service. So you're absolutely right. And I always say to people, rather than going to a court of law, go to the ICC arbitration. It's going to be much quicker. It's going to be much cheaper. It's a bit like the case I mentioned a few minutes ago in Singapore. It was absolutely crazy it ever went to court. Then it was crazy. I can remember I said I'm quite happy to give documented advice on it. And the beneficiary said, no, it's going to be a face-to-face court case and we want you there. So I had 2 days to get myself together, to put the case together, to go to Singapore for a court case that lasted 3 minutes. And that would have been resolved by arbitration much quicker, much cheaper, much easier than having gone to a national court. So you're absolutely right. Arbitration is much better. And in international trade, the International Chamber of Commerce Court of Arbitration would be in most cases the right direction to go.
we have legal members within MMTA, who are
Yeah.
lawyers and handle those disputes, and among other things, one of those big company called HFW, and they sometimes send out legal briefings. And I would advise people to read them, although they're very sort of legally and technical, they do try to simplify them. And you have those cases which then create law. So, if a precedent is set, it might then be followed. So there are sometimes really interesting highlights from those trade disputes, and there are plenty,
Absolutely.
there are really a lot.
Absolutely. And I think, what I'd reiterate just as a last thing, if I may, Paulina, is that, really, as I said right at the beginning last week, is that international trade is a rules-based system. And honestly, most disputes could be negated if the rules were widely known. And when I say the rules, I mean things like the rules of origin, the Incoterms, the UCP rules for letters of credit. If it's a bank collection, the URDG rules for collections or for guarantees. So, we do have a rules-based system. And for me, I always think it's a bit sad when it gets to a case where things do have to go to a court of law or they do have to go to arbitration, because normally you could actually roll back a little bit and look at the relevant rules-based system that we've got. And that would give the rule on the origin, on the contracting, on the payment. The rule is generally there without the need to go to arbitration. So, I think that's a really important thing. I think, international trade is rules-based, but I think the issue is the awareness of the rules globally. And, there are gaps, honestly, and that's where the issue lies, I think.
Well, John, thank you very much. Just to check, do we have any other questions? If not, I just want to thank you and also to remind everyone that we will be doing this training again, and also that we can provide training on specific issues. So if there are any components of this training or any other issues that you would like us to cover in a training, please let us know. I will be sending out a kind of feedback questionnaire, so you can let me know what aspects you would like to focus on and more details, but we could always add more granularity. So we would very much like to have John back and to give us, more training in more detail on the most thorny topics that people struggle with. So you could let us know now what you found particularly useful and what perhaps would be useful for you to train in more detail. And also you could let us know later as well, or if you'd like us to repeat this training for your colleagues.
And can I just say, Paulina, just my really grateful thanks to everyone for attending the training. I mean, it's, you know, as I say, it's thrown a huge amount of information at you. So dare I say it, I hope you've enjoyed it, guys. I hope it's been enjoyable to some extent. I've tried to make bits of it light where I've been able to do that, but I hope it's been useful. Thank you very much for your engagement. You know, that's hugely important to me as a trainer. So thank you so much for your engagement. Thanks for listening to me and attending the sessions. Thanks to MMTA, Paulina, Freya, and the colleagues for putting it all together. Really grateful thanks to all of you, and good luck with your international trading, and hope to meet some of you again at some stage. So in the meantime, again, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. So yes, please
Thank
let
you
us
so
know.
much.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
All right. Thank you all, and have a lovely rest of the day. Bye.
Bye now.